Elena Martinez Wilson stood in the center of her apartment, surveying the dining table with critical eyes. 5 years of marriage had taught her that perfection mattered on days like this, not for her sake, but for the memories they would create. The crystal wine glasses caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting prism-like patterns across the crisp white tablecloth. A bottle of Dom Perignon, the same vintage they'd shared on their wedding day, chilled in an ice bucket beside two elegant place settings. In the center, a small arrangement of calla lilies and eucalyptus added a touch of sophistication without overwhelming the intimate setting. She adjusted a fork that had strayed a millimeter out of alignment and smiled to herself. Thomas would tease her about it, that perfectionist streak that both exasperated and endeared her to him. "Some things never change," he'd say with that crooked smile that still, after all these years, made her heart skip. The aroma of the braised short ribs, Thomas's favorite, wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the scent of the vanilla candles she'd placed strategically around the living room. This scene was set. 5 years together deserved celebration, especially considering the rocky terrain they'd navigated over the past few months. Elena glanced at her watch, a delicate timepiece Thomas had given her for their 3rd anniversary, noting that she had just enough time to change before he arrived. She'd deliberately chosen to work a half day at her psychology practice, declining the pleading looks from her assistant when an emergency client had called. For once, her own life would take precedence. Dr. Patterson, her mentor and senior partner, had practically shoved her out the door. "You've cancelled your anniversary plans twice before because of work emergencies," Sophia had reminded her. "The practice won't collapse if you take one afternoon off." In their bedroom, Elena slipped out of her work clothes and into the midnight blue dress she'd purchased specifically for tonight. The silky material flowed like water over her curves, the hem stopping just above her knees, conservative enough for dinner at home but with a neckline that would remind Thomas of the woman he'd fallen in love with, not just the hard-working psychologist who sometimes collapsed into bed too exhausted for anything but sleep. As she applied a light touch of makeup, Elena's thoughts drifted to the early days of their relationship. They'd met at a charity gala 6 years ago, she attending as a guest of her mentor, he representing his family's architectural firm. Their connection had been immediate and undeniable, even as Vivian Wilson had done her best to steer her son toward the daughters of her society friends. Thomas had pursued Elena with a quiet determination that surprised those who knew him as the amenable, goes-with-the-flow Wilson son. Their courtship had been a whirlwind, culminating in a proposal after just 6 months. The wedding followed quickly, a compromise between Elena's desire for a small, intimate ceremony and the Wilson family's expectations for a social event of the season. Looking back, Elena realized that had been the first of many compromises, the beginning of a pattern they were still working to balance. The buzzing of her phone interrupted her reminiscing. A text from Maya, "Happy anniversary. Don't do anything I wouldn't do," which leaves your options wide open. "Call me tomorrow with all the details. Love you." Elena smiled and typed a quick response. Maya had been her rock through the challenges of the past 5 years, especially when it came to navigating the complex dynamics with her in-laws. Unlike Thomas's childhood friend Danielle, who carefully maintained neutrality in any family dispute, Maya had no qualms about stating exactly what she thought of Vivian's not-so-subtle manipulations. Another text chimed in, this one from her mother. "Feliz aniversario, mi hija. Tu padre y I are thinking of you and Thomas today. Call us tomorrow. Te queremos mucho." The warmth of her mother's message enveloped Elena like a hug. Carmen and Gabriel Martinez had welcomed Thomas into their family with genuine joy, despite Vivian's thinly veiled disdain for their humble backgrounds. In the early days, Elena had foolishly hoped that her in-laws would eventually embrace her with the same warmth. 5 years later, she'd accepted the reality that civil tolerance was likely the best she could expect, especially from Vivian. A final glance in the mirror confirmed she was ready. The woman reflecting back at her looked confident, beautiful, and, if she was honest, a little nervous. Tonight mattered. The past few months had been strained, with Thomas working late on a major project while Elena's practice expanded to include 2 new therapists under her supervision. They'd been ships passing in the night, exchanging quick kisses and abbreviated conversations between commitments. But they'd promised each other this night would be different, phones off, Work left at the door, just the two of them reconnecting. In the kitchen, Elena checked the short ribs one final time before reducing the heat to keep them warm. She'd prepared Thomas's favorite meal not just because it was their anniversary, but as a peace offering of sorts. Their last real conversation had ended in frustrated silence, neither willing to concede their position on the topic that had increasingly dominated their rare moments alone, when to start trying for a family. Thomas, approaching his 37th birthday, felt the pressure of time, a sentiment his mother reinforced at every opportunity with not-so-subtle comments about the joys of grandchildren. Elena understood his desire. She wanted children too, but she had just been offered partnership in the practice, a goal she'd been working toward since before they met. She needed at least a year to establish herself in the new role before taking maternity leave. 1 year seemed reasonable to her. To Thomas, influenced by his mother's dire warnings about advanced maternal age, it felt like an eternity. Elena pushed the thought away. Not tonight. Tonight was about celebration, not negotiation. She would focus on the love that had brought them together and sustained them through 5 years of misunderstandings, compromises, and growth. The sound of the buzzer made her heart leap. Thomas was early, a rare occurrence given his tendency to lose track of time when immersed in a project. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and moved toward the door with a smile already forming on her lips. But when she swung the door open, ready to fall into her husband's embrace, the sight that greeted her froze the smile in place. Vivian Wilson stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed in a tailored cream suit that probably cost more than Elena's monthly student loan payment. Her ash blonde hair was swept into an elegant chignon, not a strand out of place, and her makeup was subtle but flawless, the kind of polished appearance that Elena had once admired before understanding the rigid control it represented. Behind her, Roberto Wilson hovered awkwardly, his discomfort evident in the slight hunch of his shoulders and the way his eyes darted between his wife and his daughter-in-law. Vivian. Roberto. Elena's voice sounded strained even to her own ears. This is unexpected. Vivian's gaze swept past Elena to take in the romantic table setting behind her, a brief flicker of something, disapproval? Displeasure? Crossing her features before her social mask slipped back into place. Elena, dear. May we come in? It wasn't really a question. Vivian was already moving forward, forcing Elena to step aside or risk a collision. Roberto followed with an apologetic smile. Hope we are not interrupting anything important. The absurdity of the statement, of course they were interrupting, and of course it was important, nearly made Elena laugh. Instead, she closed the door and turned to face her unexpected guests, summoning the professional calm she used with particularly difficult clients. Actually, as you can probably tell, I'm preparing for an evening with Thomas. It's our anniversary. Yes, I'm aware of what day it is. Vivian's tone was crisp as she placed her designer handbag on the entryway table and removed her gloves with deliberate motions. That's partly why we're here. Elena felt a chill despite the warmth of the apartment. In 5 years of knowing Vivian Wilson, she'd never known the woman to acknowledge their anniversary, let alone make a special trip because of it. Something was wrong. Is Thomas all right? The question escaped before she could stop it, fear suddenly clutching at her chest. Thomas is fine, Roberto interjected quickly. Physically, at least. Vivian shot her husband a look that could have frozen the sun. Perhaps we should sit down. Elena did not move toward the seating area. I'd prefer if you could tell me why you're here. Thomas will be home soon, and as I mentioned, we have plans. Plans. Vivian repeated the word as if it were foreign to her. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a thick manila envelope. I'm afraid those plans may need to be reconsidered. Roberto stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on his wife's arm. Vivian, I really think we should wait. This isn't our place. If not us, then who? Vivian shook off his touch. Someone needs to face reality here. Elena looked between them, confusion mingling with a growing sense of dread. What are you talking about? What reality? Instead of answering, Vivian extended the envelope. These are for you. Reluctantly, Elena took it. The envelope was heavy, expensive, the kind used for important legal documents. Her name was written on the front in unfamiliar handwriting, not Thomas's. "What is this?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "Open it." Vivian's command was softened only slightly by Roberto's uncomfortable shuffling beside her. With fingers that suddenly felt numb, Elena broke the seal and pulled out a thick stack of papers. The heading on the first page sent a jolt through her system that made her physically step back. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Divorce papers. On her anniversary. Elena felt as though all the air had been sucked from the room. The words on the page blurred and swam before her eyes. She forced herself to focus, scanning for Thomas's signature, for some indication that this was really from him. There was a signature line at the bottom, but it remained blank. "I don't understand," she said finally, looking up at Vivian with growing anger. "What is this supposed to be?" Vivian's expression softened into something that on another person might have resembled compassion. On her, it looked calculated. "My son is too kind to do this himself. He's been unhappy for some time now." The statement hit Elena like a physical blow. "That's not true." "It is true." Vivian's certainty was absolute. "I'm his mother. I know when my child is suffering, even when he tries to hide it." Roberto cleared his throat. "Vivian, this isn't right. We shouldn't be here." "Be quiet, Roberto." Vivian didn't even look at her husband as she dismissed him. Her focus remained entirely on Elena. "Thomas has always been too concerned with others' feelings. He gets that from his father. He's been trying to find the right time, the right way to tell you. But there never is a right way for these things, is there?" Elena felt as though she were drowning, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Just last night, Thomas had kissed her goodnight and whispered about looking forward to their anniversary. They'd discussed visiting open houses for their potential new home over the weekend. Yes, there had been tension, disagreements. What couple didn't have those? But divorce? It was inconceivable. "I don't believe you." Elena's voice strengthened as shock gave way to anger. "If Thomas wanted a divorce, he would tell me himself. Not send his mother with papers on our anniversary. He didn't send me. I came of my own accord." Vivian sighed as if dealing with a particularly slow student. "I've watched my son struggle with this for months. The way he stays later and later at the office. The way he makes excuses to visit his father and me without you. The phone calls where he can barely keep his voice steady." Each word was a precision strike, targeting Elena's deepest insecurities about their marriage. Had she misread the situation so completely? Had her focus on work blinded her to her husband's unhappiness? No. Elena fought to steady her voice. "We talked about our future just yesterday. We're looking at houses next weekend." Vivian's smile was pitying. "Oh, Elena. Surely as a psychologist, you understand denial. Thomas has been going along with your plans because he hasn't found the courage to tell you the truth." "And what truth is that, exactly?" Elena's professional training kicked in, creating a buffer between her emotions and this surreal conversation. She would analyze, question, and hold judgment until she had all the facts. "That you want different things. You always have." Vivian moved to the dining table, running a finger along the polished edge. "Thomas wants a family, a real one, not this arrangement where you're both married to your careers. He wants children before it's too late. He wants a wife who will prioritize their family over her clients. Our decisions about when to have children are between Thomas and me." Elena struggled to keep her voice level. "With all due respect, Vivian, you don't know what we discuss in private. I know my son. And I know he's realized what I've seen from the beginning. You two are fundamentally incompatible." Vivian's gaze swept around the apartment, lingering on the framed diplomas on the wall. "You're from different worlds, with different values, different priorities." Roberto finally stepped forward, his discomfort visibly mounting. "Elena, please understand, this isn't how this wasn't my idea. Thomas doesn't know you're here." Vivian shot him a warning look. "Roberto, please." But Roberto, for once, seemed unwilling to back down completely. "No, Vivian, I agreed to come with you because you said Thomas needed our support. But this, he gestured to the papers still clutched in Elena's hand, this isn't support. This is interference. It's intervention, Vivian corrected sharply. Sometimes loving someone means doing the difficult thing they can't do for themselves. Elena watched this exchange with growing clarity. Whatever game Vivian was playing, Roberto wasn't fully on board, and if Roberto, who rarely contradicted his wife, was objecting, then perhaps. These papers, Elena held them up. Did Thomas have these drawn up? Before Vivian could answer, the sound of a key in the lock silenced all three of them. The door swung open to reveal Thomas, his arms laden with a bouquet of red roses, Elena's favorite, and a small gift bag. His expression of happy anticipation rose when he registered the tableau before him, Elena standing with papers in hand, his parents positioned like combatants in the living room. Mom? Dad? Confusion colored his voice as he stepped inside and closed the door. What are you doing here? The moment stretched out, a pause where multiple futures seemed to hang in the balance. Elena found her voice first. Your mother brought divorce papers. She says you're too kind to give them to me yourself. Thomas's face went from confusion to shock in an instant. What? He crossed to Elena, setting down his gifts on the entryway table without taking his eyes off the papers in her hand. When he reached her, he took the documents and scanned the first page, his expression morphing from disbelief to dawning horror. Mom, he said quietly, dangerously, what have you done? Vivian's composure slipped for just a moment before she rallied. What you couldn't do yourself. I've watched you suffer, Thomas. I know how trapped you felt. Trapped? Thomas looked at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. What are you talking about? Your unhappiness. Your regrets about rushing into marriage. The way your career has been affected by trying to match Elena's ambitions. Vivian spoke with absolute conviction. I've heard it in your voice every time we talk. I've seen it in your eyes at Sunday dinners. Thomas turned to Elena, his expression stricken. Elena, none of this is true. I don't know what she's talking about. Elena wanted to believe him, but doubt had taken root. You have seemed distant lately. Working late, taking calls in another room. Because of the Peterson project. You know how demanding that client is. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Elena recognized as a sign of his distress. And the calls, those were to the realtor about the houses we've been looking at. I wanted it to be a surprise, to have a few perfect options lined up for our anniversary weekend. He turned back to his mother, anger replacing confusion. How could you do this? Vivian didn't back down. I did what any mother would do, protect her child. This marriage has been slowly destroying you, whether you can admit it or not. That's not true, Thomas's voice rose. Mom, you've never given Elena a fair chance. From the beginning, you've found ways to criticize her, to undermine our relationship. But this, he held up the papers, this crosses every line. Roberto placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. Vivian, I think we should go. She shrugged him off. Not until Thomas admits what he's been too afraid to say. He wants children. Elena keeps putting it off. He wants to take over the family firm. Elena wants to stay in the city close to her practice. These are irreconcilable differences. They're differences we're working through together, Thomas countered. As a couple. Without your interference. Elena watched him defend their marriage with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. Thomas, if you're unhappy, I'm not. His response was immediate and firm as he turned to face her. Are we facing challenges? Yes. Have I been frustrated about the timeline for starting a family? Also yes. But that doesn't mean I want a divorce. It means we need to keep talking, keep working together. He held up the papers. These aren't even real divorce papers, are they, Mom? Vivian's silence was damning. Thomas examined the documents more closely. These are templates. Where did you get these? Did you have someone draft these up to look official? His voice rose in disbelief. This is insane, Mom, even for you. They're proper legal formats, Vivian defended, though her certainty seemed to be wavering. I had my attorney provide them. I thought once you saw them, you'd realize it was the push you needed. The push I needed? Thomas repeated incredulously. To divorce my wife on our anniversary? Who does that? Elena felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. This wasn't Thomas's doing. It was Vivian's manipulation, her final, desperate attempt to separate them. But even as that realization settled, another emotion rose to take its place, fury. Vivian, Elena's voice was deadly calm, I need you to leave our home. Now. Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, a united front. Both of you, please go. Roberto, who had remained largely silent during the confrontation, stepped forward. Thomas, Elena, I am so sorry. I didn't know the full extent of what Vivian planned. He turned to his wife. Come on. We've done enough damage. For a moment, it seemed Vivian might refuse. She looked between her son and his wife, something like panic flickering beneath her composed exterior. Thomas, you're making a mistake. She'll never understand you like I do. She can't give you the life you deserve. Goodbye, Mom, Thomas said firmly, his arm encircling Elena's waist. Roberto took Vivian's elbow, guiding her toward the door with gentle but insistent pressure. She allowed herself to be led, but at the threshold, she turned back. When you realize I'm right, I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting for you to come to your senses. And then they were gone, the door closing behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. In the sudden silence, Elena became acutely aware of the scent of the roses Thomas had brought, the ticking of the clock marking each second of their anniversary, and the warmth of her husband's arm still wrapped around her waist. She turned to face him, searching his eyes for any sign that Vivian's words had contained even a grain of truth. Thomas, she began, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. We need to talk about what just happened. He nodded, his expression solemn. We do. But first, he reached for her hands, enfolding them in his own. Elena Martinez Wilson, I love you. I have loved you every day for the past 5 years, and I will continue to love you for all the years to come. Whatever issues we need to work through, we'll do it together. There is no world in which I would ask for a divorce, and certainly not in the cruel way my mother suggested. The sincerity in his voice melted some of the ice that had formed around Elena's heart during Vivian's visit. Still, questions remained. But some of what she said, about the children, about your career. We have had disagreements about those things. Disagreements, yes. Not irreconcilable differences. Thomas led her to the couch, where they sat facing each other, still holding hands. Every couple has conflicts to navigate. That doesn't mean we're doomed. I know that intellectually, Elena admitted. But emotionally, hearing your mother articulate all my deepest fears about our marriage, it struck a nerve. Thomas sighed deeply. My mother has always had an uncanny ability to locate vulnerabilities and exploit them. I'm so sorry she did that to you. To us. Has she tried things like this before? With other relationships? Thomas's laugh held no humor. Every girlfriend that ever had faced some version of my mother's disapproval. But you're the only one who ever threatened her position in my life enough for her to go to these extremes. Threatened her position? Thomas, I've never tried to come between you and your parents. In fact, I've encouraged our Sunday dinners, our holiday traditions with them, despite how uncomfortable they make me. I know you have. He squeezed her hands. But my mother sees relationships as zero-sum. In her mind, every bit of love and attention I give to you is taken away from her. She doesn't understand that love doesn't work that way. Elena considered this. In her professional practice, she'd encountered similar dynamics, parents who couldn't separate their identity from their children's, who viewed a child's independence as a personal rejection rather than a healthy evolution. But understanding the psychology didn't make it any easier to be on the receiving end of such manipulation. What are we going to do? She asked finally. I can't continue like this, Thomas. Today crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. He nodded solemnly. I know. And I don't expect you to pretend it didn't happen or to simply forgive and forget. We need boundaries, clear, firm boundaries with consequences if they're violated. I should have established those years ago, and that's on me. It's not just on you. We're a team, remember? Elena managed a small smile. But yes, boundaries are overdue. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling around them. The romantic dinner Elena had planned seemed both trivial and incredibly important in the aftermath of Vivian's visit. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas nodded toward the dining table. You went to a lot of trouble for tonight. I wanted it to be special. He raised her hands to his lips, kissing each one gently. It still can be. Different, but special. How about we open that champagne, serve up whatever smells so amazing in the kitchen, and talk. Really talk about boundaries with my parents, about our timeline for children, about what we both want for our future. The suggestion was so reasonable, so characteristic of the man she'd married, that Elena felt the tension begin to ease from her shoulders. I'd like that. Thomas rose, retrieving the flowers and gift he'd set aside during the confrontation. These are for you. 5 years deserves celebration, especially considering what we just survived. Elena accepted the roses, burying her face in their fragrance for a moment before meeting his eyes. Thank you. For these, and for defending our marriage. I know standing up to your mother isn't easy for you. It's getting easier, he admitted. Especially when the alternative is losing you. As Thomas moved to the kitchen to help with dinner, Elena allowed herself a moment to process everything that had happened. The anniversary she'd planned had been derailed in the most dramatic way possible, yet somehow, she felt closer to her husband now than she had in months. Perhaps that was Vivian's unintended gift, a crisis that forced them to confront issues they'd been dancing around, to reaffirm their commitment to each other and to the life they were building together. The doorbell rang, startling both of them. Thomas froze, spatula in hand. If that's my mother again, I'll get it, Elena said, steeling herself for another confrontation. But when she opened the door, it was Maya standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a small wrapped package in the other. Her bright smile faltered as she took in Elena's expression. Surprise. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop off a little anniversary gift. She paused, studying Elena's face. Whoa. What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. Elena felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up. Not a ghost. Just my mother-in-law with fake divorce papers. Maya's eyes widened to comical proportions. Excuse me, what? Oh my God, I'm going to need details. And we're all going to need this wine. Thomas appeared behind Elena, greeting Ma with a tired smile. Perfect timing, as always. Seriously, what did I just walk into? Maya stepped inside, handing the wine to Thomas and giving Elena a quick, fierce hug. The Wilson family drama to end all dramas, Elena said, leading her friend to the living room. Vivian decided our anniversary was the perfect time to present me with divorce papers she had drawn up, claiming Thomas was too kind to deliver them himself. She did what? Maya's outrage was both gratifying and grounding. Please tell me you're pressing charges for impersonation or fraud or being a complete psycho. Despite everything, Elena found herself laughing. Leave it to Maya to cut through the tension with righteous indignation. No charges. But we are establishing some serious boundaries going forward. Thomas returned from the kitchen with 3 wine glasses. Maya, your timing really is perfect. We could use a friendly face right now. And I could use the full story, Maya replied, accepting a glass. Because this sounds like the plot of a telenovela, and I need to know every detail. As they moved to the couch, Elena and Thomas exchanged a look, one that acknowledged the storm they just weathered and the ones that might lie ahead, but also the strength of their bond. 5 years had brought challenges neither could have anticipated on their wedding day, but they were still standing, still fighting for the relationship. In an odd way, Vivian's dramatic intervention had given them the push they needed, not away from each other, as she had intended, but toward a stronger, more honest union. Let me tell you what happened, Elena began, settling in beside her husband. And then Thomas and I are going to have a very important conversation about family boundaries. Maya raised her glass in a toast. To boundaries, and to surviving in-laws from hell. To us, Thomas added softly, his eyes on Elena, past, present, and future. As they clinked glasses, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but with Thomas at her side, she was ready to face whatever came next, even Vivian Wilson and her misguided attempts to separate them. Their anniversary hadn't turned out as planned, but perhaps it had given them something more valuable than a perfect dinner, a chance to reaffirm their commitment not just to the easy parts of marriage, but to working through the difficult ones together. And that, Elena realized, was worth celebrating indeed. Throughout dinner, the conversation flowed between light-hearted reminiscences and more serious discussion of the boundaries they needed to establish with Thomas's parents. Maya's presence proved to be exactly what they needed, her outsider perspective and unwavering support creating a buffer that allowed them to process the day's events without spiraling into anger or recrimination. "So let me get this straight," Maya said, refilling her wine glass. "Vivian shows up unannounced, on your anniversary, with fake divorce papers, and tries to convince you that Thomas wants out of the marriage? That's not just crossing a line, that's obliterating it, setting fire to the remains, and dancing on the ashes." Thomas winced. "That's my mother, never does anything halfway. And Roberto just went along with this?" Maya turned to Thomas. "I always thought your dad was the reasonable one." "He is, comparatively," Thomas sighed. "But he's spent 40 years letting my mother run the show. Standing up to her doesn't come easily to him." Elena touched Thomas's hand gently. He did try to intervene, in his way. "Too little too late," Maya muttered into her wine glass. Thomas couldn't disagree. His father's passive acceptance of his mother's behavior had enabled her for decades. It was a pattern Thomas recognized in himself, the tendency to smooth things over, to keep the peace rather than confront conflict directly. Today had shown him where that path ultimately led. "I need to call them tomorrow," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Not to yell or accuse, but to clearly establish that what happened today can never happen again. And that there will be consequences if it does. Elena studied him, her psychologist's mind cataloging the shift in his demeanor. "What kind of consequences?" "Distance. Time apart. If they can't respect our marriage, our decisions, then they won't be as involved in our lives." The word felt both terrifying and liberating. "I know it sounds harsh, but it's not harsh, it's healthy," Elena assured him. "Boundaries aren't punishments. They're necessary protections for relationships that matter." Maya nodded approvingly. "Look at my best friend, dropping therapy wisdom like it's hot." The moment of levity was welcome. Thomas squeezed Elena's hand, grateful for her understanding. "I just keep thinking, what if we had children? Would we want them exposed to this kind of manipulation?" The question hung in the air, touching on the very issue that had been a source of tension between them. Elena took a deep breath. "Speaking of children," she began cautiously, "I think that's a conversation we need to have. Not tonight, necessarily, but soon. Without your mother's influence or my work stress clouding the discussion." Thomas nodded. "I'd like that. Because the truth is, I do want children with you, Elena. But not at the cost of your happiness or fulfillment. There has to be a way forward that works for both of us." Maya glanced between them. "And that's my cue to make a graceful exit. You two clearly have some talking to do that doesn't require an audience." "You don't have to go," Elena protested, though without much conviction. As helpful as Maya's presence had been, there were conversations that needed to happen between just the two of them. Maya was already standing, gathering her purse. "Yes, I absolutely do. Besides, I have a deadline tomorrow, and my editor will have my head if I miss another one." She bent to hug Elena fiercely. "Call me tomorrow, okay? I want to know you're all right." "I will," Elena promised, returning the embrace. Maya turned to Thomas, her expression suddenly serious. "Take care of her. And yourself. What Vivian did today wasn't just manipulative, it was cruel. Don't minimize that just because she's your mother." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I won't. And thank you, Maya, for being here tonight, and for being in Elena's corner all these years." Someone's got to balance out the Wilson family drama, Maya replied with a wink, but her tone was affectionate. She'd known Thomas long enough to understand that he wasn't his mother, despite sharing her DNA. After Maya left, a comfortable silence settled between Elena and Thomas. The candles had burned lower, casting a soft, golden glow over the remains of their dinner. Elena felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, the emotional roller coaster of the day taking its toll. Thomas seemed to sense her fatigue. It's been quite an anniversary, hasn't it? Not exactly what I had planned, Elena admitted with a rueful smile. I'm sorry about that. He reached across the table, taking her hand. I had plans too, you know. Before everything. The flowers and gift were lovely. There was more. Thomas hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. Wait here. He disappeared into their bedroom, returning moments later with a small velvet box. Elena's heart quickened. It was too large for a ring, too small for jewelry, larger than earrings perhaps. Thomas placed it before her with an unexpectedly shy smile. This was supposed to be romantic. Now it feels like I have something to prove after my mother's performance. But I want you to have it anyway. Elena opened the box carefully. Inside was a key, attached to a silver keychain engraved with their initials and anniversary date. She looked up, puzzled. A key? To a weekend getaway, Thomas explained. I rented a cabin up in the mountains for next weekend. Completely off the grid, no cell service, no internet. Just us, the forest, and time to reconnect. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she found endearing even after all these years. I thought we could use the time away to really talk, without distractions or interruptions. Tears pricked at Elena's eyes, not of sadness or lingering hurt, but of profound gratitude for this man who continually chose her, who fought for their relationship even when it wasn't easy. It's perfect, Thomas. Thomas will be home any minute, Elena said, struggling to keep her voice steady as she stared at the divorce papers in her trembling hands. The weight of Vivian's accusations hung in the air like a toxic cloud, suffocating Elena's carefully cultivated composure. If what you're saying is true, he can tell me himself. Vivian's porcelain features remained impassive, but her eyes, so similar to Thomas's in color yet so different in warmth, gleamed with something Elena couldn't quite define. Was it triumph? Anticipation? Or perhaps a twisted form of maternal protectiveness that had crossed into destructive territory long ago? My son has been carrying this burden for months, Vivian continued, her manicured hand resting on the back of the dining chair Elena had positioned so meticulously for her anniversary dinner. He comes to our home when you're working late, sits in his childhood room, and tries to find the words. But he can't bear to hurt you, especially knowing how fragile your family history has made you. The calculated reference to Elena's parents' difficult early years as immigrants, years that Vivian had only learned about during a rare vulnerable moment at last Thanksgiving's dinner, struck like a physical blow. Elena had shared that story as a testament to resilience, to the power of commitment through hardship. Vivian had transformed it into a weapon. Roberto shifted uncomfortably. Vivian, please, no, Roberto, she interrupted sharply. Someone needs to speak the truth. Elena deserves that much, at least. Before Elena could respond, the unmistakable sound of a key in the lock silenced all three of them. The door swung open to reveal Thomas, his tall frame filling the doorway, arms laden with roses and a small gift bag embossed with the logo of Elena's favorite jewelry store. His expression of happy anticipation transformed into confusion as he took in the scene before him. Mom? Dad? The bouquet of roses dipped slightly in his grasp as his gaze moved from his parents to his wife's ashen face. What are you doing here? Elena found her voice first, the papers clutched like a shield in front of her. Your mother brought divorce papers. She says you're too kind to give them to me yourself. Thomas's face went blank with shock, the kind of stunned incomprehension that couldn't be faked. He set the flowers and gift on the entry console with mechanical precision, as if focusing on the simple task might make the surreal scene before him dissolve into normalcy. What? The single word held volumes of confusion. Vivian stepped forward, her posture radiating unwavering certainty. Thomas, darling, There's no need to pretend anymore. I've taken care of the difficult part. Thomas crossed to Elena, his eyes never leaving the papers in her hands. When he reached her, his fingers brushed hers as he took the documents, scanning the first page with growing incredulity. "Mom," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "what have you done?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its implications. Vivian's composure wavered for only a fraction of a second before she rallied. "What you couldn't do yourself." Her voice softened with what might have passed for compassion if Elena hadn't spent 5 years learning to recognize the manipulative undertones. "I know how trapped you felt, especially these past few months." "Trapped?" Thomas looked at his mother as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "What are you talking about?" "Your unhappiness." Vivian spoke with absolute conviction, each word landing like a precision strike. "Your regrets about rushing into marriage before you were ready, the way your career at the firm has suffered while you've tried to match Elena's ambitions." Elena watched Thomas's face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that Vivian's words contained even a kernel of truth. What she saw instead was dawning horror. "Elena," Thomas turned to her, distress evident in every line of his face, "none of this is true." "I don't know what she's talking about." A small, insecure voice inside Elena whispered traitorous doubts. "You have been distant lately. Working late, taking calls in another room. Because of the Peterson project." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd seen countless times. "You know how demanding that client is." "And the calls?" He stopped, looking almost guilty before continuing, "Those were to the realtor about the houses we've been looking at. I wanted it to be a surprise, to have a few perfect options lined up for our anniversary weekend." He turned back to his mother, confusion giving way to anger. "How could you do this?" Vivian didn't retreat an inch. "I did what any mother would do, protect her child. This marriage has been slowly destroying you, whether you can admit it or not." "That's not true." Thomas's voice rose uncharacteristically, the control he typically maintained starting to fray at the edges. "Mom, you've never given Elena a fair chance. From the beginning, you've found ways to criticize her, to undermine our relationship. But this," he held up the papers, "this crosses every line." Roberto placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, his discomfort now palpable. "Vivian, I think we should go." She shrugged him off. "Not until Thomas admits what he's been too afraid to say. He wants children. Elena keeps putting it off. He wants to take over the family firm. Elena wants to stay in the city close to her practice." Her voice hardened. "These are irreconcilable differences." "They're differences we're working through together," Thomas countered with unexpected firmness. "As a couple. Without your interference." Elena watched this exchange with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. The Thomas before her now, defending their marriage with unwavering conviction, seemed at odds with the image Vivian had painted of a man silently suffering in an unhappy union. "Thomas," she said softly, "if you're unhappy, I'm not." His response was immediate as he turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "Are we facing challenges?" "Yes." "Have I been frustrated about the timeline for starting a family?" "Also yes. But that doesn't mean I want a divorce. It means we need to keep talking, keep working together." He looked down at the papers in his hand, examining them more closely. His expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "These aren't even real divorce papers, are they, Mom?" Vivian's silence was damning. Thomas flipped through several pages, his architectural eye trained to notice details. "These are templates. The signature line doesn't even have my name pre-printed." He looked up, incredulous. "Where did you get these? Did you have someone draft these up to look official?" His voice rose in disbelief. "This is insane, Mom, even for you." Vivian's perfect composure showed its first significant crack. "They're proper legal formats," she defended, though her certainty seemed to be wavering. "I had my attorney provide them. I thought once you saw them, you'd realize it was the push you needed." "The push I needed?" Thomas repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "To divorce my wife on our anniversary? Who does that?" Elena felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. This wasn't Thomas's doing. It was Vivian's manipulation, her final, desperate attempt to separate them. But even as that realization settled, another emotion rose to take its place: fury. Vivian, Elena's voice was deadly calm, I need you to leave our home. Now. Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, a united front. Both of you, please go. Roberto stepped forward, his complexion ashen. Thomas, Elena, I am so sorry. I didn't know the full extent of what Vivian planned. He turned to his wife, uncharacteristic firmness in his voice. Come on. We've done enough damage. For a moment, it seemed Vivian might refuse. She looked between her son and his wife, something like panic flickering beneath her composed exterior. Thomas, you're making a mistake. She'll never understand you like I do. She can't give you the life you deserve. Goodbye, Mom, Thomas said firmly, his arm encircling Elena's waist in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. Roberto took Vivian's elbow, guiding her toward the door with gentle but insistent pressure. She allowed herself to be led, but at the threshold, she turned back. When you realize I'm right, I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting for you to come to your senses. And then they were gone, the door closing behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. In the sudden silence, Elena became acutely aware of the scent of the roses Thomas had brought, the ticking of the clock marking each second of their anniversary, and the warmth of her husband's arm still wrapped around her waist. The romantic dinner she'd prepared now seemed like an artifact from another lifetime, a reminder of how quickly everything could change. I'm so sorry, Thomas whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I had no idea she would do something like this. Elena pulled away slightly, needing to see his face as she asked the question burning in her throat. But some of what she said. Is any of it true? Have you been talking to her about our problems? Thomas ran both hands through his hair, leaving it standing in disarray, a physical manifestation of his distress. No. Not in the way she implied. He paced a few steps, gathering his thoughts. Have I vented occasional frustrations? Yes, but no more than anyone would about normal marital disagreements. And always in the context of Elena and I are working through this or we're figuring it out together. He stopped pacing, turning to face her fully. But she has a way of extracting information, asking seemingly innocent questions and then piecing together a narrative that suits her agenda. And what agenda is that, exactly? Elena asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Thomas sighed deeply, resignation settling on his features. Separating us. It's always been her goal, from the moment she realized I was serious about you. But why? What threat do I pose to her? You're the first woman I've loved who I put ahead of my mother. The simplicity of his answer belied its profound implications. Before you, I always chose family obligations over relationships when pushed. I let previous girlfriends go when my mother found fault with them. But with you, his voice softened, with you, I chose differently. And she's never forgiven either of us for that. Elena absorbed this, connecting dots that had eluded her for years. The sudden cancellations of plans when Vivian claimed to need Thomas for family emergencies that later proved minor. The pointed comments about Elena's career being selfish compared to other paths that would allow more family time. The frequent reminders of Thomas's childhood friends who had married women who prioritized family over career. It had all been strategic, a campaign designed to undermine their bond until it fractured. Thomas, Elena said carefully, we need to talk about what this means. For us. For our relationship with your parents going forward. He nodded solemnly. I know. And we will. He glanced at the dining table, the candles now burning low. You went to a lot of trouble for tonight. I wanted it to be special. The admission felt small against the backdrop of what had transpired, yet important too, a reminder of the love that had brought them to this anniversary in the first place. Thomas crossed to the table, trailing his fingers along the edge with a wistfulness that tugged at Elena's heart. It still can be. Different, but special. He turned to her, resolution firming his features. Let's not let my mother rob us of our anniversary too. How about we open that champagne, serve up whatever smells so amazing in the kitchen, and talk. Really talk about boundaries with my parents, about our timeline for children, about what we both want for our future. The suggestion was so reasonable, so characteristic of the man she'd married, that Elena felt the tension begin to ease from her shoulders. This was the Thomas she knew and loved, thoughtful, respectful, always seeking common ground. "I'd like that." Thomas retrieved the flowers and gift he'd set aside during the confrontation. "These are for you. 5 years deserves celebration, especially considering what we just survived." Elena accepted the roses, burying her face in their fragrance for a moment before meeting his eyes. "Thank you. For these, and for defending our marriage. I know standing up to your mother isn't easy for you." "It's getting easier," he admitted with a rueful smile. "Especially when the alternative is losing you." As Thomas moved to the kitchen to help with dinner, Elena allowed herself a moment to process everything that had happened. The anniversary she'd planned had been derailed in the most dramatic way possible, yet somehow, she felt closer to her husband now than she had in months. Perhaps that was Vivian's unintended gift, a crisis that forced them to confront issues they'd been dancing around, to reaffirm their commitment to each other and to the life they were building together. The doorbell rang, startling both of them. Thomas froze, spatula in hand. "If that's my mother again." "I'll get it," Elena said, steeling herself for another confrontation. But when she opened the door, it was Maya standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a small wrapped package in the other. Her bright smile faltered as she took in Elena's expression. "Surprise. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop off a little anniversary gift." She paused, studying Elena's face. "Whoa, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Elena felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up. "Not a ghost. Just my mother-in-law with fake divorce papers." Maya's eyes widened to comical proportions. "Excuse me, what? Oh my God, I'm going to need details. And we're all going to need this wine." Thomas appeared behind Elena, greeting Ma with a tired smile. "Perfect timing, as always. Seriously, what did I just walk into?" Maya stepped inside, handing the wine to Thomas and giving Elena a quick, fierce hug. "The Wilson family drama to end all dramas," Elena said, leading her friend to the living room. "Vivian decided our anniversary was the perfect time to present me with divorce papers she had drawn up, claiming Thomas was too kind to deliver them himself." "She did what?" Maya's outrage was both gratifying and grounding. "Please tell me you're pressing charges for impersonation or fraud or being a complete psycho." Despite everything, Elena found herself laughing. Leave it to Maya to cut through the tension with righteous indignation. "No charges. But we are establishing some serious boundaries going forward." Thomas returned from the kitchen with 3 wine glasses. "Maya, your timing really is perfect. We could use a friendly face right now." "And I could use the full story," Maya replied, accepting a glass, "because this sounds like the plot of a telenovela, and I need to know every detail." As they moved to the couch, Elena and Thomas exchanged a look, one that acknowledged the storm they'd just weathered and the ones that might lie ahead, but also the strength of their bond. 5 years had brought challenges neither could have anticipated on their wedding day, but they were still standing, still fighting for the relationship. In an odd way, Vivian's dramatic intervention had given them the push they needed, not away from each other, as she had intended, but toward a stronger, more honest union. "Let me tell you what happened," Elena began, settling in beside her husband. "And then Thomas and I are going to have a very important conversation about family boundaries." Maya raised her glass in a toast. "To boundaries, and to surviving in-laws from hell." "To us," Thomas added softly, his eyes on Elena. "Past, present, and future." "Thomas will be home any minute," Elena said, struggling to keep her voice steady as she stared at the divorce papers in her trembling hands. The weight of Vivian's accusations hung in the air like a toxic cloud, suffocating Elena's carefully cultivated composure. "If what you're saying is true, he can tell me himself." Vivian's porcelain features remained impassive, but her eyes, so similar to Thomas's in color yet so different in warmth, gleamed with something Elena couldn't quite define. Was it triumph? Anticipation? Or perhaps a twisted form of maternal protectiveness that had crossed into destructive territory long ago? My son has been carrying this burden for months, Vivian continued, her manicured hand resting on the back of the dining chair Elena had positioned so meticulously for her anniversary dinner. He comes to our home when you're working late, sits in his childhood room, and tries to find the words. But he can't bear to hurt you, especially knowing how fragile your family history has made you. The calculated reference to Elena's parents' difficult early years as immigrants, years that Vivian had only learned about during a rare vulnerable moment at last Thanksgiving's dinner, struck like a physical blow. Elena had shared that story as a testament to resilience, to the power of commitment through hardship. Vivian had transformed it into a weapon. Roberto shifted uncomfortably. "Vivian, please, no, Roberto," she interrupted sharply. "Someone needs to speak the truth. Elena deserves that much, at least." Before Elena could respond, the unmistakable sound of a key in the lock silenced all three of them. The door swung open to reveal Thomas, his tall frame filling the doorway, arms laden with roses and a small gift bag embossed with the logo of Elena's favorite jewelry store. His expression of happy anticipation transformed into confusion as he took in the scene before him. "Mom? Dad?" The bouquet of roses dipped slightly in his grasp as his gaze moved from his parents to his wife's ashen face. "What are you doing here?" Elena found her voice first, the papers clutched like a shield in front of her. "Your mother brought divorce papers. She says you're too kind to give them to me yourself." Thomas's face went blank with shock, the kind of stunned incomprehension that couldn't be faked. He set the flowers and gift on the entry console with mechanical precision, as if focusing on the simple task might make the surreal scene before him dissolve into normalcy. "What?" The single word held volumes of confusion. Vivian stepped forward, her posture radiating unwavering certainty. "Thomas, darling, there's no need to pretend anymore. I've taken care of the difficult part." Thomas crossed to Elena, his eyes never leaving the papers in her hands. When he reached her, his fingers brushed hers as he took the documents, scanning the first page with growing incredulity. "Mom," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "what have you done?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its implications. Vivian's composure wavered for only a fraction of a second before she rallied. "What you couldn't do yourself." Her voice softened with what might have passed for compassion if Elena hadn't spent 5 years learning to recognize the manipulative undertones. "I know how trapped you felt, especially these past few months." "Trapped?" Thomas looked at his mother as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "What are you talking about?" "Your unhappiness." Vivian spoke with absolute conviction, each word landing like a precision strike. "Your regrets about rushing into marriage before you were ready, the way your career at the firm has suffered while you've tried to match Elena's ambitions." Elena watched Thomas's face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that Vivian's words contained even a kernel of truth. What she saw instead was dawning horror. "Elena," Thomas turned to her, distress evident in every line of his face, "none of this is true." "I don't know what she's talking about." A small, insecure voice inside Elena whispered traitorous doubts. "You have been distant lately. Working late, taking calls in another room. Because of the Peterson project." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd seen countless times. "You know how demanding that client is." "And the calls?" He stopped, looking almost guilty before continuing, "Those were to the realtor about the houses we've been looking at. I wanted it to be a surprise, to have a few perfect options lined up for our anniversary weekend." He turned back to his mother, confusion giving way to anger. "How could you do this?" Vivian didn't retreat an inch. "I did what any mother would do, protect her child. This marriage has been slowly destroying you, whether you can admit it or not." "That's not true." Thomas's voice rose uncharacteristically, the control he typically maintained starting to fray at the edges. "Mom, you've never given Elena a fair chance. From the beginning, you've found ways to criticize her, to undermine our relationship. But this," he held up the papers, "this crosses every line." Roberto placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, his discomfort now palpable. "Vivian, I think we should go." She shrugged him off. Not until Thomas admits what he's been too afraid to say. He wants children. Elena keeps putting it off. He wants to take over the family firm. Elena wants to stay in the city close to her practice. Her voice hardened. These are irreconcilable differences. Their differences we're working through together, Thomas countered with unexpected firmness. As a couple. Without your interference. Elena watched this exchange with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. The Thomas before her now, defending their marriage with unwavering conviction, seemed at odds with the image Vivian had painted of a man silently suffering in an unhappy union. "Thomas," she said softly, "if you're unhappy, I'm not." His response was immediate as he turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "Are we facing challenges?" "Yes." "Have I been frustrated about the timeline for starting a family?" "Also yes. But that doesn't mean I want a divorce. It means we need to keep talking, keep working together." He looked down at the papers in his hand, examining them more closely. His expression shifted from anger to disbelief. "These aren't even real divorce papers, are they, Mom?" Vivian's silence was damning. Thomas flipped through several pages, his architectural eye trained to notice details. "These are templates. The signature line doesn't even have my name pre-printed." He looked up, incredulous. "Where did you get these? Did you have someone draft these up to look official?" His voice rose in disbelief. "This is insane, Mom, even for you." Vivian's perfect composure showed its first significant crack. "They're proper legal formats," she defended, though her certainty seemed to be wavering. "I had my attorney provide them. I thought once you saw them, you'd realize it was the push you needed." "The push I needed?" Thomas repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "To divorce my wife on our anniversary? Who does that?" Elena felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. This wasn't Thomas's doing. It was Vivian's manipulation, her final, desperate attempt to separate them. But even as that realization settled, another emotion rose to take its place, fury. "Vivian," Elena's voice was deadly calm, "I need you to leave our home. Now." Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, a united front. "Both of you, please go." Roberto stepped forward, his complexion ashen. "Thomas, Elena, I am so sorry. I didn't know the full extent of what Vivian planned." He turned to his wife, uncharacteristic firmness in his voice. "Come on. We've done enough damage." For a moment, it seemed Vivian might refuse. She looked between her son and his wife, something like panic flickering beneath her composed exterior. "Thomas, you're making a mistake. She'll never understand you like I do. She can't give you the life you deserve." "Goodbye, Mom," Thomas said firmly, his arm encircling Elena's waist in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. Roberto took Vivian's elbow, guiding her toward the door with gentle but insistent pressure. She allowed herself to be led, but at the threshold, she turned back. "When you realize I'm right, I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting for you to come to your senses." And then they were gone, the door closing behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded final. In the sudden silence, Elena became acutely aware of the scent of the roses Thomas had brought, the ticking of the clock marking each second of their anniversary, and the warmth of her husband's arm still wrapped around her waist. The romantic dinner she'd prepared now seemed like an artifact from another lifetime, a reminder of how quickly everything could change. "I'm so sorry," Thomas whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I had no idea she would do something like this." Elena pulled away slightly, needing to see his face as she asked the question burning in her throat. "But some of what she said. Is any of it true? Have you been talking to her about our problems?" Thomas ran both hands through his hair, leaving it standing in disarray, a physical manifestation of his distress. "No. Not in the way she implied." He paced a few steps, gathering his thoughts. "Have I vented occasional frustrations? Yes, but no more than anyone would about normal marital disagreements. And always in the context of Elena and I are working through this or we're figuring it out together." He stopped pacing, turning to face her fully. "But she has a way of extracting information, asking seemingly innocent questions and then piecing together a narrative that suits her agenda. And what agenda is that, exactly? Elena asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Thomas sighed deeply, resignation settling on his features. Separating us. It's always been her goal, from the moment she realized I was serious about you. But why? What threat do I pose to her? You're the first woman I've loved who I put ahead of my mother. The simplicity of his answer belied its profound implications. Before you, I always chose family obligations over relationships when pushed. I let previous girlfriends go when my mother found fault with them. But with you, his voice softened, with you, I chose differently. And she's never forgiven either of us for that. Elena absorbed this, connecting dots that had eluded her for years. The sudden cancellations of plans when Vivian claimed to need Thomas for family emergencies that later proved minor. The pointed comments about Elena's career being selfish compared to other paths that would allow more family time. The frequent reminders of Thomas's childhood friends who had married women who prioritized family over career. It had all been strategic, a campaign designed to undermine their bond until it fractured. Thomas, Elena said carefully, we need to talk about what this means. For us. For our relationship with your parents going forward. He nodded solemnly. I know. And we will. He glanced at the dining table, the candles now burning low. You went to a lot of trouble for tonight. I wanted it to be special. The admission felt small against the backdrop of what had transpired, yet important too, a reminder of the love that had brought them to this anniversary in the first place. Thomas crossed to the table, trailing his fingers along the edge with a wistfulness that tugged at Elena's heart. It still can be. Different, but special. He turned to her, resolution firming his features. Let's not let my mother rob us of our anniversary too. How about we open that champagne, serve up whatever smells so amazing in the kitchen, and talk. Really talk, about boundaries with my parents, about our timeline for children, about what we both want for our future. The suggestion was so reasonable, so characteristic of the man she'd married, that Elena felt the tension begin to ease from her shoulders. This was the Thomas she knew and loved, thoughtful, respectful, always seeking common ground. I'd like that. Thomas retrieved the flowers and gift he'd set aside during the confrontation. These are for you. 5 years deserves celebration, especially considering what we just survived. Elena accepted the roses, burying her face in their fragrance for a moment before meeting his eyes. Thank you. For these, and for defending our marriage. I know standing up to your mother isn't easy for you. It's getting easier, he admitted with a rueful smile. Especially when the alternative is losing you. As Thomas moved to the kitchen to help with dinner, Elena allowed herself a moment to process everything that had happened. The anniversary she'd planned had been derailed in the most dramatic way possible, yet somehow, she felt closer to her husband now than she had in months. Perhaps that was Vivian's unintended gift, a crisis that forced them to confront issues they'd been dancing around, to reaffirm their commitment to each other and to the life they were building together. The doorbell rang, startling both of them. Thomas froze, spatula in hand. If that's my mother again. I'll get it, Elena said, steeling herself for another confrontation. But when she opened the door, it was Maya standing there, a bottle of wine in one hand and a small wrapped package in the other. Her bright smile faltered as she took in Elena's expression. Surprise. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop off a little anniversary gift. She paused, studying Elena's face. Whoa, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. Elena felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up. Not a ghost. Just my mother-in-law with fake divorce papers. Maya's eyes widened to comical proportions. Excuse me, what? Oh my God, I'm going to need details. And we're all going to need this wine. Thomas appeared behind Elena, greeting Ma with a tired smile. Perfect timing, as always. Seriously, what did I just walk into? Maya stepped inside, handing the wine to Thomas and giving Elena a quick, fierce hug. The Wilson family drama to end all dramas, Elena said, leading her friend to the living room. Vivian decided our anniversary was the perfect time to present me with divorce papers she had drawn up, claiming Thomas was too kind to deliver them himself. She did what? Maya's outrage was both gratifying and grounding. Please tell me you're pressing charges for impersonation or fraud or being a complete psycho. Despite everything, Elena found herself laughing. Leave it to Maya to cut through the tension with righteous indignation. No charges. But we are establishing some serious boundaries going forward. Thomas returned from the kitchen with 3 wine glasses. Maya, your timing really is perfect. We could use a friendly face right now. And I could use the full story, Maya replied, accepting a glass, because this sounds like the plot of a telenovela, and I need to know every detail. As they moved to the couch, Elena and Thomas exchanged a look, one that acknowledged the storm they just weathered and the ones that might lie ahead, but also the strength of their bond. 5 years had brought challenges neither could have anticipated on their wedding day, but they were still standing, still fighting for the relationship. In an odd way, Vivian's dramatic intervention had given them the push they needed, not away from each other, as she had intended, but toward a stronger, more honest union. Let me tell you what happened, Elena began, settling in beside her husband. And then Thomas and I are going to have a very important conversation about family boundaries. Maya raised her glass in a toast. To boundaries, and to surviving in-laws from hell. To us, Thomas added softly, his eyes on Elena, past, present, and future. Elena stood in the empty living room of their apartment, sunlight streaming through the bare windows that had, until yesterday, been dressed in the curtained sheets selected 5 years earlier when they'd first moved in. The space looked larger without furniture, almost unrecognizable as the home where they'd weathered so many storms, including the most significant one on their 5th anniversary. That's the last box, Thomas announced, setting down a cardboard container labeled kitchen, fragile near the door. He straightened, surveying the empty apartment with a mixture of nostalgia and excitement. Hard to believe we're really leaving. 6 years of memories, Elena agreed, running her hand along the wall where their photos had hung. Good and bad. Thomas crossed to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hands coming to rest protectively over the gentle swell of her belly. At 4 months pregnant, Elena was just beginning to show, a small, perfect curve that never failed to fill Thomas with wonder when he touched it. Mostly good, he murmured against her hair. And the bad ones made us stronger. Elena leaned back into his embrace, covering his hands with her own. They did. She turned in his arms to face him. Are you ready for this? New house, baby on the way, all of it? More than ready. His smile was radiant, confident in a way that still surprised her sometimes. The past year had brought remarkable changes to Thomas, a newfound certainty in his decisions, an unwavering commitment to the boundaries they'd established, a willingness to prioritize their small family above all else. I've never been more sure of anything. The journey to this moment had not been smooth or straightforward. The months following their tumultuous anniversary had been filled with adjustments, negotiations, and occasional setbacks as they navigated their new reality. But through it all, Thomas had remained steadfast in his commitment to protecting their marriage from his mother's interference. The moving truck should be here in an hour, Elena said, glancing at her watch. Do you want to do one final walkthrough? Make sure we haven't forgotten anything. They moved through the apartment together, room by room, each space triggering memories both spoken and unspoken. The kitchen where they'd prepared countless meals together, the bathroom where Elena had stared in disbelief at the positive pregnancy test 3 months ago, the bedroom where they'd weathered arguments and reconciliations and quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper. Remember when we first saw this place? Thomas asked as they stood in the doorway of the now empty bedroom. You said it was too big for just the 2 of us. Elena laughed softly. And you said we'd grow into it. We did. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing with practiced ease. And now we're growing out of it. The decision to buy a house had been set in motion during their weekend at the mountain cabin, but finding the right property had taken time. They'd viewed dozens of homes, weighing proximity to their workplaces against space, neighborhood amenities, and school districts. The Victorian they'd finally purchased in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood 20 minutes from downtown had charmed them both instantly, Elena with its character and history, Thomas with its solid structure and architectural details. "Do you think Ma will ever forgive us for moving out of her neighborhood?" Elena asked as they completed their circuit of the apartment. "She'll adjust, especially when she sees the guest room we've set up for her at the new place." Thomas grinned. "Besides, it's not like we're moving to another state. It's 15 minutes by car. 15 minutes that might as well be 15 hours according to her last text." Elena pulled out her phone, reading aloud, "Who moves to the suburbs? Next you'll be buying matching sweaters and joining a book club for parents." "Both excellent ideas," Thomas deadpanned, earning a playful swat from his wife. The sound of the buzzer interrupted their banter. "That must be the movers," Elena said, moving to answer it. But when she opened the door, it wasn't the moving company's employees who stood in the hallway. It was Roberto Wilson, looking slightly uncomfortable in the way he always did when operating outside his wife's direct supervision. "Roberto," Elena said, surprise evident in her voice, "we weren't expecting you." "I know, I'm sorry to drop by unannounced." He shifted his weight, a small gift bag dangling from one hand. "I wanted to catch you before you left." "May I come in?" Elena glanced back at Thomas, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Their relationship with his parents had improved marginally over the past year. Roberto had made genuine efforts to respect their boundaries, and while Vivian's attempts were more perfunctory, she had at least maintained a civil facade during their limited interactions. Of course, Elena stepped aside, allowing her father-in-law to enter the barren apartment. "Wow," Roberto said, taking in the empty space. "It's really happening." "You're really leaving?" "Moving day," Thomas confirmed, stepping forward to shake his father's hand. "The truck will be here soon." Roberto nodded, a flicker of emotion crossing his features too quickly to identify. "I won't keep you long. He extended the gift bag toward Elena, "wanted to give you this. For the new house. And the baby." Elena accepted the bag with murmured thanks, carefully removing the tissue paper to reveal a small silver picture frame. Inside was a black and white sonogram image, their baby's first picture, which they had shared with their families just 2 weeks earlier. The frame was elegantly simple, with delicate engraving along the bottom edge, "Baby Wilson, first portrait." "Roberto, it's beautiful," Elena said softly, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I had it custom made," he admitted, looking pleased at her reaction. "Your first family home, your first child. These are milestones worth marking." Thomas moved closer, examining the frame with appreciation. "Thank you, Dad. This means a lot." An awkward silence descended, broken only when Roberto cleared his throat. "Your mother wanted to come too, but she has that charity luncheon today. The one she chairs every year." The excuse was transparent. Vivian Wilson hadn't spontaneously visited their apartment in the entire 6 years of their marriage, and her presence on moving day would have been more surprising than her absence. Still, Roberto's attempt to maintain social niceties was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Of course, Thomas nodded, neither of them choosing to acknowledge the implausibility of Vivian's schedule conflict. "Please tell her we appreciate her." "Thoughts?" "I will." Roberto hesitated, then added, "She's trying, you know. In her way. This past year hasn't been easy for her." Elena bit back a reflexive retort about whose fault that might be. The past year hadn't been easy for any of them, but the clear boundaries Thomas had established had made it manageable. Sunday dinners had resumed after a 3-month hiatus, though they now occurred monthly rather than weekly. Phone calls were cordial but brief. Holiday celebrations were carefully structured to include both families while minimizing potential friction. "Change is difficult," Elena acknowledged diplomatically. "But necessary sometimes." Roberto studied her for a moment, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "Yes, it is." He turned to Thomas. "Your mother and I were proud of you, son. The work you're doing at the firm, the family you're building. Even if we don't always show it in the right ways." The admission, so uncharacteristically direct for Roberto, who typically allowed Vivian to dictate the emotional temperature of any interaction, clearly caught Thomas off guard. He blinked rapidly, his hand seeking Elena's almost unconsciously. "Thank you, Dad," he said finally, his voice slightly rough. "That means more than you know." Another silence, this one less strained than the first. Roberto glanced at his watch. "I should go. Let you finish up here. Your mother will be wondering where I am." "I'm glad you came," Thomas said, and Elena was surprised to realize he meant it. For all the complications in their relationship with his parents, there remained the core of genuine love between father and son, a connection that had weathered Vivian's manipulations and Thomas's necessary distancing over the past year. Roberto paused at the door. "The house in Oakwood Hills, it's a good neighborhood. Safe. Good schools." He smiled faintly. "My father used to take me fishing at the creek that runs behind those properties. Clear water, good for kids to explore when they're a little older." With that simple observation, a bridge between past and future, a gentle acknowledgement of their growing family, Roberto took his leave. Elena and Thomas stood in the doorway, watching his retreating figure until he disappeared into the elevator. "That was unexpected," Elena said at last. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not entirely. Dad's always operated on a different timeline than Mom. He processes things more slowly, comes to his own conclusions eventually." "Do you think this means he's truly accepted our boundaries? That he understands why they were necessary?" "I think he's trying." Thomas guided her back into the apartment, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. "And right now, that's enough." The moving truck arrived 30 minutes later, right on schedule. Elena supervised the loading process while Thomas handled the paperwork, both of them caught in the practical whirlwind of transition that temporarily pushed deeper reflections aside. By mid-afternoon, they stood in the empty apartment one last time, keys in hand, ready to surrender the space that had witnessed their first years together as a married couple. "Ready?" Thomas asked, his finger hovering over the light switch. Elena took one last look around, imprinting the silent emptiness in her memory. "Ready." They locked the door behind them, leaving the keys with the building superintendent as arranged. Outside, Thomas's car was packed with their overnight essentials and the few items they had entrusted to the moving company: Elena's jewelry, Thomas's architectural awards, the sonogram in its new silver frame. The drive to their new home was quiet, each of them lost in private thoughts as the urban landscape gradually gave way to wider streets, larger yards, older trees. Their Victorian stood proudly on a corner lot, its sage green exterior and crisp white trim freshly painted as part of the renovations they'd completed before moving in. The wraparound porch, which had been one of the features that sold Elena on the property, was deepened in afternoon shadow, its swing gently moving in the late summer breeze. "Home," Thomas said simply as he pulled into the driveway. The movers had already unloaded most of their furniture, placing boxes in the appropriate rooms according to their labels. Elena and Thomas moved through the house together, making mental notes of what needed to be unpacked first, what could wait until tomorrow, what projects they wanted to tackle in the coming weeks and months. The nursery, formerly a small sitting room off the master bedroom, was painted a soft, gender-neutral green that Elena had selected with painstaking care. The crib Thomas's grandfather had crafted decades ago, recently refinished and safety-checked, stood ready beneath the window. A rocking chair, a changing table, a small bookshelf already filled with childhood classics, the room waited expectantly for its tiny occupant, still months away from arrival. "I think we should put Roberto's gift here," Elena decided, placing the framed sonogram on the narrow shelf above the changing table. "Where the baby can see their first portrait when we're changing them." Thomas wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they both gazed at the small black and white image. "Perfect." They ordered pizza for dinner, eating it picnic style on the living room floor since their dining table was still wrapped in protective blankets. The summer evening stretched long and golden around them, neighborhood sounds filtering through the open windows, children playing, sprinklers running, a distant lawnmower making its final pass of the day. Different from the apartment, Thomas observed as they listened to a group of kids racing past on bicycles, their happy shouts echoing down the street. "Better," Elena decided, resting her head on his shoulder. "I didn't realize how much I missed having actual neighbors, a real community. Even if it means Maya will accuse us of becoming suburban clichés?" especially then. Elena smiled, imagining their vivacious friend's reaction to their new environment. She secretly loves it. I give her 6 months before she's looking at real estate listings out here. They cleaned up their simple meal and continued unpacking essential items, sheets for the bed, towels for the bathroom, coffee supplies for the morning. By the time they fell into bed, exhausted but content, they'd made enough progress to feel settled in the most important ways. "First night in our new home," Thomas murmured, his voice already thick with approaching sleep. "First of many." Elena curled against him, one hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "First of many," she agreed, and let the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of their new house lull her into dreams of the future they were building together. The transition from city apartment to suburban home coincided with significant professional shifts for both of them. Elena's practice had evolved to accommodate her eventual maternity leave, with a carefully selected associate taking on some of her long-term clients and Sophia overseeing the entire process with her usual wisdom and efficiency. The partnership Elena had been working toward had been officially offered and accepted, with the understanding that her role would temporarily shift after the baby's birth. Thomas, meanwhile, had made his own professional adjustments. After years of working exclusively on corporate projects at his father's firm, he had begun taking on more residential commissions, finding unexpected satisfaction in designing spaces for families rather than companies. The shift had raised eyebrows at Wilson Architecture, particularly from senior partners who had expected Thomas to follow his father's exact path, but Roberto had surprised everyone by supporting his son's expanded focus. "Your grandfather designed homes, you know," he told Thomas during a rare one-on-one lunch 3 months earlier, before the firm moved exclusively to commercial work. "He said you could tell more about a society by the homes its people lived in than by its office buildings or shopping centers." The observation had validated Thomas's instincts in a way he hadn't realized he needed. That his father had shared it, had bothered to remember in really his own father's philosophy, felt like a subtle but significant endorsement of Thomas's evolving professional identity. As summer gave way to fall, Elena and Thomas settled into their new home and neighborhood with surprising ease. They joined the local historical society, committed to maintaining the architectural integrity of their Victorian while modernizing its systems. They introduced themselves to neighbors, attended a block party, planted bulbs in the front garden that would bloom in spring around the time their baby was due. "We've become those people," Elena laughed one evening as they returned from a neighborhood association meeting where they'd volunteered to help with the Halloween festival. Maya was right. "Would you change it?" Thomas asked, hanging their jackets in the front hall closet. Elena considered the question seriously. "No," she decided, "I wouldn't change any of it." This statement encompassed more than their move to the suburbs or their impending parenthood. It acknowledged the entirety of their journey, including the painful confrontation with Vivian that had catalyzed so many of the positive changes in their lives. Their relationship with Thomas's parents continued to evolve in small, sometimes unpredictable ways. Roberto had become a more frequent visitor, often stopping by on Saturday mornings with bagels and an eagerness to help with whatever house project Thomas was tackling that weekend. His interactions with Elena had warmed considerably, his initial awkwardness giving way to genuine interest in her practice and her pregnancy. Vivian remained more complicated. The boundaries Thomas had established were maintaining, creating a framework within which they could interact without the manipulative undercurrents that had previously characterized their relationship. She adhered to the letter of these boundaries, if not always their spirit, and while she had never offered the sincere apology Thomas had initially demanded, she had demonstrated a grudging acceptance of their autonomy. The announcement of Elena's pregnancy had shifted the dynamic yet again. Vivian's genuine excitement about becoming a grandmother had momentarily transcended her controlling tendencies, leading to a brief period of relatively uncomplicated interaction. She had even, to Elena's astonishment, asked thoughtful questions about Elena's birth plan and postpartum support needs, offering suggestions rather than directives. "It's like pregnancy has humanized me in her eyes," Elena observed to Maya during one of their weekly coffee dates, "as if confirming my biological function has finally given me value in the Wilson family hierarchy." Maya had snorted inelegantly. "Take the win where you can get it. Maybe producing an actual human will finally make her see you as a full person rather than an inconvenient obstacle to her son's devotion." The assessment was harsh but not entirely inaccurate. Vivian's worldview centered on family legacy in a way that Elena's career ambitions had always threatened. The pregnancy represented Elena's commitment to that legacy, even if it came on her own timeline and with her own conditions. As Elena's second trimester progressed, bringing with it increased energy and the delightful sensation of first movements, she and Thomas began the process of transforming the house into the home they'd envisioned. Weekends were devoted to renovation projects, restoring original hardwood floors hidden beneath carpet, stripping decades of paint from ornate Victorian moldings, updating the kitchen with modern appliances while preserving its vintage charm. "I think the baby just kicked in approval," Elena announced one Saturday afternoon as Thomas installed the subway tile backsplash they'd selected for the kitchen. She was perched on a stool, supposedly supervising but mostly admiring the competent precision of her husband's movements. Thomas immediately set down his tools and crossed to her, placing his hand on the spot she indicated. After a moment of stillness, he was rewarded with a distinct flutter against his palm. "Hello there, little one," he murmured, his voice filled with wonder. "Do you like what we're doing with the place?" Another kick, stronger this time, made them both laugh. "I'll take that as a yes," Elena said, covering Thomas's hand with her own. These moments, small, perfect islands of joy in the midst of their busy lives, anchored them through the occasional storms that still arose. Vivian's attempt to plan an elaborate baby shower without consulting Elena. A tense Sunday dinner where Thomas's mother had questioned their decision not to learn the baby's sex before birth. Roberto's well-intentioned but presumptuous announcement that he'd started a college fund for his grandchild without discussing it with them first. Each challenge was met with a united front they'd forged in the aftermath of their anniversary confrontation. They discussed, decided, and communicated their positions together, presenting Vivian and Roberto with clear, consistent messages that left no room for manipulation or misinterpretation. "I'm proud of us," Thomas said one night as they lay in bed after successfully navigating yet another boundary conversation with his parents. "A year ago, I wouldn't have believed we could reach this point." Elena traced patterns on his chest, considering the observation. "We've come a long way. Both of us. Especially me," he acknowledged ruefully. "I spent so many years trying to keep everyone happy, never realizing that it was making all of us miserable in different ways." "Not miserable," Elena corrected gently. "Just incomplete. We were living half versions of our potential relationship because we were allowing outside forces to dictate its terms." Thomas pulled her closer, his hand settling protectively over their growing child. "No more. This is our family, our rules. Our happiness," Elena added, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "Our happiness," he agreed, and they fell asleep wrapped in the certainty of that simple truth. As winter settled over their neighborhood, transforming the Victorians' detailed architecture with delicate traceries of frost and snow, Elena entered her third trimester. The baby's movements became stronger, more deliberate, stretches and hiccups and somersaults that Thomas could now feel and sometimes even see through Elena's stretched skin. They attended birthing classes at the local hospital, joining a cohort of expectant parents navigating the same mixture of excitement and trepidation. Elena's professional training gave her a theoretical understanding of the psychological aspects of pregnancy and early parenthood, but she found herself humbled by the practical realities and physical challenges of creating new life. "Theory and practice are very different things," she admitted to Sophia during a prenatal check-in about her clients. "I've spent years helping new mothers through postpartum adjustments, but I had no idea how utterly exhausting just growing a human could be." Sophia had smiled knowingly. "The most valuable lesson any therapist can learn is that academic knowledge is no substitute for lived experience. Your practice will be richer for this, Elena." The observation proved prescient as Elena found herself developing deeper empathy for her clients who were parents, particularly those struggling with work-life balance. Her own impending transition from career-focused professional to working mother suddenly seemed less theoretical and more daunting with each passing week. Thomas, meanwhile, had thrown himself into preparations for the baby's arrival with characteristic thoroughness. He'd read every recommended book, researched pediatricians with the same diligence he applied to architectural specifications, and spent evenings assembling furniture and installing safety features that wouldn't be needed for months. The baby won't be climbing stairs for at least a year, Elena pointed out gently as he installed gates at both the top and bottom of their main staircase one snowy Saturday. Better to have systems in place before we're sleep deprived, he countered, testing the gate's latch with meticulous attention to detail. Besides, this gives me something productive to do with all this nervous energy. Elena understood the sentiment. As her body changed and her mobility decreased, she found herself channeling her own anticipatory anxiety into organizing, setting up systems for bills and household management that could function smoothly during the baby's early months, preparing frozen meals that could be easily reheated during the postpartum period, creating detailed notes for her professional replacement. The holidays arrived with their usual mixture of joy and familial complexity. They hosted Thanksgiving at their new home, a decision that allowed them to control the environment and guest list while establishing their own traditions. Elena's parents, Gabriel and Carmen, arrived first, bringing homemade dishes and unabashed excitement about their first grandchild. "Mija," Carmen had whispered, embracing Elena with tears in her eyes. "You look so beautiful." The genuine warmth of her mother's pride contrasted sharply with Vivian's more reserved greeting when she and Roberto arrived an hour later. But even Vivian seemed affected by the season and the setting, bringing an expensive bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider for the mother-to-be, and keeping her critical observations about the house's untapped potential to a minimum. To everyone's surprise, the two sets of grandparents-to-be found unexpected common ground in their shared excitement about the baby. Gabriel engaged Roberto in a lengthy discussion of fishing spots suitable for young children, while Carmen tactfully redirected Vivian's more overbearing suggestions about childcare with her own gentle wisdom as a mother and grandmother to Maya's sister's children. "Your mother is a diplomat," Thomas murmured appreciatively as they observed Carmen skillfully handling Vivian's pronouncement that the baby would undoubtedly need a formal nursery at the Wilson family home. "She's had years of practice managing strong personalities at the restaurant," Elena replied, referring to her parents' successful business. "Vivian Wilson doesn't intimidate her in the slightest." The meal itself progressed with surprising harmony. Gabriel carved the turkey with expert precision. Carmen's traditional sides complemented Vivian's more elaborate contributions. Roberto kept wine glasses filled while Thomas ensured the conversation remained in neutral, pleasant territory. As they gathered around the table, their first major family celebration in the new house, Elena felt a wave of gratitude so intense it momentarily overwhelmed her. She glanced around at the faces of their families, noticing the efforts each was making to ensure the day's success. Perhaps the baby had created a common purpose, a shared future that transcended past grievances and misunderstandings. "I'd like to propose a toast," Thomas said, raising his glass. "To family, those we were born to and those we choose. To traditions we honor and new ones we create. And to our child, who will know the love of all the people gathered at this table." The sentiment was simple but profound, acknowledging both the complications and the blessings of their extended family. Elena watched as even Vivian's expression softened momentarily, humanity peeking through her carefully maintained facade as she clinked her glass against the others. "To family," everyone echoed, and in that moment, imperfect but genuine, Elena allowed herself to hope that their child might experience the best of both worlds, the warmth and openness of her own family background and the strength of tradition and persistence that characterized the Wilsons at their best. Christmas followed with a similar mixture of familiar ritual and emerging tradition. They divided the holiday between both families, spending Christmas Eve with the Martinezes and Christmas Day with the Wilsons, a schedule that honored their respective family customs while establishing boundaries that protected their time together. New Year's Eve found them alone at home, Elena's advancing pregnancy making late-night celebrations less appealing than a quiet evening by the fire. As midnight approached, they sat together on their living room sofa, a mug of herbal tea cradled in Elena's hands, a single glass of champagne in Thomas's. "Any resolutions for the new year?" Elena asked as they watched the countdown on television, the volume turned low. Thomas considered the question seriously. "To be present. With you, with the baby. To remember what matters most, even when work and family obligations get complicated." "That's a good one," Elena approved. "Mine is similar, to practice the same compassion with myself that I encourage in my clients. To accept that I won't be perfect at balancing motherhood and my career, at least not all the time. You'll be amazing at both, Thomas said with such certainty that Elena couldn't help but believe him, at least in that moment. As the clock struck midnight and muted cheers erupted from the television, they shared a kiss that held both reflection and anticipation, gratitude for the year behind them, with all its challenges and growth, and hope for the one ahead, with its imminent expansion of their family. "Happy New Year, Elena," Thomas whispered against her lips. "Happy New Year," she replied, and then guessed as a particularly forceful kick from their baby made them both laugh. "I think someone else is celebrating too." January brought a series of snowstorms that transformed their neighborhood into a winter wonderland and slowed the pace of their lives in ways that proved unexpectedly welcome. Projects around the house were completed. The nursery was fully prepared. Hospital bags were packed. Birth plans were finalized and shared with their medical team. As Elena's due date approached, a strange calm settled over both of them, the quiet before a storm, perhaps, or simply the natural culmination of months of preparation and anticipation. They spent evenings together reading, Thomas often with his hand resting on Elena's belly, feeling the increasingly cramped movements of their child. They took slow walks around the neighborhood when weather permitted, nodding to neighbors who called out well wishes and predictions about the baby's arrival. "Everyone has an opinion," Elena observed after their elderly neighbor across the street had confidently declared that her low-carried pregnancy meant a boy. "And they all contradict each other." "It's good practice," Thomas pointed out. "Once the baby is actually here, the unsolicited advice will probably increase exponentially." Elena groaned at the prospect. "Remind me again why we're doing this?" Thomas pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Because despite all the complications and challenges, being parents together is the greatest adventure we could imagine." The simple truth of the statement settled around them like a blanket. For all the preparation, all the research, all the boundary setting and family negotiations, the heart of their journey toward parenthood remained the deep, abiding love they shared and the desire to expand that love to include a child. February arrived with milder temperatures and the first hints of approaching spring. Crocuses pushed through the melting snow in their garden. Birds returned to the massive oak tree in their backyard. The days lengthened incrementally, offering more light and renewed energy after the winter's hibernation. Elena's due date, February 15th, came and went without any signs of labor. Her doctor reassured her that first babies were often late, that her body and the baby would know when the time was right. Still, the waiting became increasingly challenging as physical discomfort mounted and anticipation built to nearly unbearable levels. "I never thought I'd say this," Elena admitted as they walked slowly around their block for the third time that day, her doctor having recommended movement to encourage labor, "but I'm actually looking forward to the physical pain of childbirth if it means this waiting game will be over." Thomas squeezed her hand sympathetically. "Is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable?" She leaned against him gratefully. "Just keep being you. Patient, supportive, steady." "That I can do," he promised, and they continued their slow circuit, stopping occasionally for Elena to catch her breath or shift position as the baby pressed against sensitive internal organs. The call to her parents and his that evening followed the same pattern it had for the past week. No news, still waiting. Yes, she was feeling fine considering the circumstances. No, they didn't need anything at the moment. The conversations were shorter now, everyone's patience with small talk wearing thin as they collectively held their breath for the main event. Vivian actually sounded sympathetic about the waiting, Elena noted with mild surprise after hanging up. "No suggestions about inducement methods or criticism of my doctor's approach." "She remembers," Thomas said simply. "For all her faults, she was genuinely excited when she was pregnant with me. Dad says she talked about nothing else for months." The observation offered a rare glimpse of Vivian as a younger woman, before years of social positioning and control had calcified her natural maternal instincts into something more rigid and demanding. Elena found herself wondering, not for the first time, what experiences had shaped her mother-in-law's approach to family and motherhood. Later that night, as Elena shifted uncomfortably in bed, unable to find the position that accommodated her enormous belly, she felt the first twinge, different from the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. More focused, more purposeful. She waited, breathing through it, noting the time on the bedside clock. 20 minutes later, Another contraction, slightly stronger. She nudged Thomas, who was sleeping soundly beside her. "Thomas," she whispered, not wanting to alarm him if this was another false start. "I think it might be starting." He was instantly awake, years of architectural emergencies having trained him to move from sleep to alertness in seconds. Contractions? How far apart? Should we call the doctor? Elena couldn't help but smile at his immediate shift into action mode. "Let's time a few more before we call anyone." They're still far apart and mild. They spent the next few hours in quiet preparation, Elena focusing on her breathing techniques as the contractions gradually intensified, Thomas timing them meticulously and referring to the stages of labor they'd learned about in birthing class. By dawn, when the intervals had shortened to 10 minutes and the intensity had increased significantly, they called the doctor and received instructions to head to the hospital. The drive was surreal, the empty pre-rush hour streets, the pale winter sunlight just beginning to illuminate their neighborhood, the hospital looming ahead like a fortress of modern medicine. Thomas pulled up to the emergency entrance where a nurse met them with a wheelchair, his calm efficiency belying the anxiety Elena knew he must be feeling. "I'll park and be right with you," he promised, kissing her quickly before helping her into the chair. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of increasing pain, medical checks, and the strange timelessness of labor. Thomas remained by Elena's side throughout, a steady presence as she navigated the most physically challenging experience of her life. He advocated for her when necessary, reminded her of her breathing techniques when pain threatened to overwhelm her focus, and simply held her hand when that was all she needed. "You're doing amazingly," he told her repeatedly, his voice a lifeline during the most intense contractions. "You're the strongest person I know, Elena." When the moment finally arrived and their child entered the world with a powerful cry, the pure joy on Thomas's face as he cut the umbilical cord would be forever etched in Elena's memory. The doctor's announcement, "It's a girl," sent a wave of love so powerful through Elena that she felt momentarily dizzy with its intensity. Their daughter was placed on Elena's chest, tiny and perfect and utterly miraculous. Dark hair like Thomas's, olive skin like Elena's, a determined little chin that could have come from either side of the family. She blinked up at them with unfocused eyes, her cries settling into hiccuping breaths as she adjusted to the shocking transition from womb to world. "Hello, Sophia Carmen Wilson," Elena whispered, using the name they'd selected months ago to honor both her mentor and her mother. "We've been waiting for you." Thomas leaned down, one hand gently cradling their daughter's head, the other still holding Elena's. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like her mother." In that moment, with their small family complete and whole, the journey of the past year, from the crisis of their anniversary to the miracle of their daughter's birth, came full circle. The boundaries they'd established, the growth they'd experienced, the renewed commitment they'd made to each other had all led to this singular point in time, the beginning of their greatest collaboration. Later, as Ella rested in the recovery room with baby Sophia sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her bed, Thomas made the necessary calls to their families. She listened to his side of the conversations, noting the pure joy in his voice as he shared the news, the diplomatic way he handled Vivian's immediate questions about visitation, the warmth with which he invited her parents to be the first visitors the following morning. "Mom wants to come tonight," he reported after hanging up with his parents. "I told her the hospital only allows partners during evening hours and that you needed rest. She's not happy, but Dad talked her down." "Will she be okay waiting until tomorrow?" Elena asked, genuinely concerned about starting their daughter's life with more family tension. Thomas looked down at his sleeping daughter, marveling at how someone so tiny could radiate such profound presence. At 3 months old, Sophia Carmen Wilson had already established herself as the undisputed center of her parents' universe, her smallest gestures, a yawn, a stretch, the flutter of her impossibly long eyelashes, capable of stopping conversations mid-sentence and drawing both Elena and Thomas into states of besotted wonder. "She has your nose," he whispered to Elena, who sat in the rocking chair beside the crib, her own eyes heavy with the particular exhaustion that only new parents truly understand. "And your determination." Elena smiled tiredly. "She definitely has your lungs." The pediatrician said she's never heard such strong vocalizations from a baby her age. "A future architect," Thomas suggested with a grin. always making her specifications known. Or a future psychologist, Elena countered, already skilled at getting people to do exactly what she wants. They shared a quiet laugh, careful not to disturb the hard-won peace they'd achieved after an hour of walking, rocking, and gentle singing. Sophia had fought sleep with impressive tenacity before finally surrendering to exhaustion, her tiny fists still curled defiantly even in slumber. "We should sleep while she does," Elena said, rising stiffly from the rocking chair. Months of pregnancy followed by weeks of awkward nursing positions had left her with a perpetual ache in her lower back. "Your mother will be here at 10, and we need all the energy we can muster." Thomas nodded, taking one last look at their daughter before following Elena to their bedroom across the hall. They left both doors open, the baby monitor glowing reassuringly on their nightstand despite the short distance between rooms. Some parental anxieties transcended logic, they'd discovered as they settled into bed, bodies curving toward each other in the familiar pattern of years together. Thomas felt the now familiar mixture of profound joy and utter exhaustion that had characterized the first months of fatherhood. Every day brought new discoveries, new challenges, new depths to his love for both Elena and Sophia. It also brought new anxieties, new tensions, and new negotiations, both between the two of them and with the various family members who had definite opinions about every aspect of their parenting. Chief among these opinionated relatives was, of course, Vivian Wilson. "Do you think she'll notice we moved the antique rocking horse to the guest room?" Elena murmured, already half asleep. Thomas sighed. The hand-carved wooden horse had been his as a child, preserved in pristine condition in his parents' attic until Vivian had presented it to Sophia with great ceremony during her first visit to meet her granddaughter. It was beautiful, valuable, and completely inappropriate for an infant, its original lead paint and small detachable parts making it more museum piece than toy. "Of course she'll notice," he replied, stroking Elena's hair. "But we agreed, our house, our safety standards." Elena acknowledged sleepily. "At least she's bringing lunch. One less meal to worry about." Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep, leaving Thomas awake with his thoughts. His mother's weekly visits had become a complex ritual, equal parts genuine grandmotherly affection and thinly veiled attempts to influence their parenting decisions. Vivian adored Sophia, of that Thomas had no doubt. But her love came wrapped in criticism. "Is she sleeping through the night yet? You always did by 6 weeks, and unsolicited advice, pacifiers create dental problems, Thomas." "We never allowed them." They maintained the boundaries they'd established before Sophia's birth, but the arrival of a grandchild had created new territories to defend. Elena, still adjusting to motherhood and gradually transitioning back to part-time work at her practice, found Vivian's visits both helpful and draining, grateful for the extra hands but exhausted by the constant vigilance required to deflect Vivian's more problematic suggestions. Sleep claimed Thomas eventually, though it seemed mere minutes before Sophia's hungry cries pulled him back to consciousness. He glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m., and reached for Elena, but she was already rising, her maternal instincts having apparently evolved to function even from the depths of exhaustion. "I've got her," she mumbled, padding across to the nursery. Thomas followed, knowing from experience that while Elena would handle the feeding, he could manage the subsequent diaper change and resettling, allowing her to return to sleep more quickly. Their nighttime choreography had developed through trial and error, each of them learning to anticipate the other's needs just as they anticipated Sophia's. By morning, neither felt particularly rested, but coffee and the magic of Sophia's morning smiles, a recent and heart-melting development, provided enough energy to face the day. Thomas prepared breakfast while Elena nursed, the three of them eventually gathering at the kitchen table in what had become their morning ritual. "What time is your conference call?" Elena asked, sipping her coffee with the reverence of someone for whom caffeine had become essential life support. 11, Thomas replied, mentally reviewing the day's schedule. "I should be done by 12:30, which gives us some buffer before my mother leaves." "Are you still planning to take Sophia to your office this afternoon?" Elena nodded. "Sophia has her monthly check-in with Dr. Chen at 2, and then we'll head to the practice. I'm just consulting on a few cases today, nothing too intensive." Their careful scheduling reflected the delicate balance they'd established since Elena had begun transitioning back to work. Thomas had rearranged his own schedule to work from home 3 days a week, and they developed an intricate calendar system to ensure that Sophia was always with one of them when possible. They'd interviewed several potential nannies but hadn't yet found someone they both trusted completely, a decision that Vivian had opinions about, naturally. A proper nanny would have professional training, she'd pointed out during her last visit. When you were an infant, we had Mrs. Holloway, who had worked for British diplomatic families. Your developmental milestones were always right on schedule. Thomas had refrained from pointing out that his proper nanny had also been cold and rigid, more concerned with adhering to schedules than responding to a child's emotional needs. That was a battle for another day. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Thomas lifted Sophia from her bouncy seat, cradling her against his shoulder as he went to answer it. Vivian Wilson stood on the porch, elegantly dressed as always, a large insulated bag in one hand and a gift-wrapped package in the other. Her face transformed when she saw Sophia, genuine delight temporarily erasing the perpetual settled disapproval that characterized most of her expressions. "There's my precious girl," she cooed, setting her packages down to hold out her arms. Thomas handed Sophia over, noting the genuine tenderness with which his mother cradled her granddaughter. For all their complicated history, he couldn't deny that Vivian loved Sophia completely and unconditionally, perhaps the first person in decades she had loved without agenda or expectation. "Good morning, Mother," he said, picking up the abandoned packages and ushering her inside. "How was your drive?" "The traffic on Oakwood Avenue was dreadful," Vivian replied, not taking her eyes off Sophia. "They really should time those lights better." "Has she been changed recently?" "She looks a bit fussy." And so it began, the familiar mixture of helpful presence and subtle criticism that characterized Vivian's visits. Thomas exchanged a look with Elena, who had emerged from the kitchen with an extra cup of coffee for her mother-in-law. Their silent communication, part resignation, part determination, conveyed everything they needed to know. They would get through this visit as they had all the others, together, with clear boundaries and focused on Sophia's well-being. "She's just had her morning feeding and change," Elena explained, offering the coffee. "That's her I'm contemplating the universe face, not her fussy face." Vivian accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Well, she's always been an observant child. Just like Thomas was, taking everything in, processing it in that serious little mind." The comparison, delivered with genuine affection, caught them both off guard. Vivian rarely spoke about Thomas's infancy with anything resembling warmth or nostalgia. Usually, his childhood was referenced only as evidence of proper child-rearing techniques or as comparison points for Sophia's development. "Was I really like that?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious about this glimpse into his early life. Something softened in Vivian's expression. "Oh yes, you would stare at your mobile for hours, not just batting at it like other babies, but studying it as if trying to understand its construction. Your father said you were engineering it in your mind." She stroked Sophia's cheek gently. "I see that same focus in her sometimes." The moment of vulnerability was brief but significant. Elena caught Thomas's eye again, her expression thoughtful. These glimpses of the woman Vivian might have been, might still be, underneath years of carefully constructed social armor, were becoming more frequent since Sophia's birth. They never lasted long, but each one revealed a dimension to his mother that Thomas had rarely seen growing up. "We've set up in the living room," Elena said, guiding Vivian through the hall. "There's fresh coffee, and Thomas made scones this morning." "How domestic you've become," Vivian observed, though without her usual edge. "The house is looking well kept, considering." Elena let the backhanded compliment pass without comment. "What's in the bag?" "It smells wonderful." "Cocoa Vin," Vivian replied, settling into the armchair they'd positioned for optimal baby-holding comfort. "I made it yesterday and brought it for your dinner tonight." New parents never have time to cook properly. The gesture was thoughtful, the implied criticism, that their own cooking was somehow substandard, so typically Vivian that Thomas almost laughed. His mother contained multitudes, genuine care wrapped in judgment, generosity tinged with control. "That's very kind, thank you," Elena said, accepting both aspects of the gift with equal grace. As they settled into their normal visiting routine, Vivian holding Sophia while Thomas and Elena rotated between entertaining his mother and accomplishing necessary household tasks. Thomas found himself observing the dynamics with new eyes. Parenthood had shifted something fundamental in his relationship with his mother, creating both new tensions and unexpected connections. Vivian, for all her controlling tendencies, genuinely wanted to be part of Sophia's life, and despite their complicated history, Thomas wanted that too, wanted his daughter to know her grandmother, to benefit from the love and family history that Vivian could provide. The challenge lay in facilitating that connection while maintaining the boundaries that protected their small family unit. "I noticed you moved the rocking horse," Vivian commented eventually, as Thomas had known she would. "It was hand-carved by a Swedish artisan, you know." "Your grandfather commissioned it." "It's in the guest room," he replied evenly. "We're saving it for when Sophia's older." The pediatrician advised against having items with original paint in the nursery until she's past the mouthing stage. He braced for an argument, but to his surprise, Vivian merely nodded. "That's sensible, I suppose. Things were different in my day, we weren't so cautious about everything. But science has advanced." She adjusted Sophia's blanket with meticulous care. "Perhaps when she's a year old, it could come back out. Properly supervised, of course." The reasonable response was so unexpected that Thomas exchanged a startled glance with Elena, who looked equally surprised. "Yes, that sounds like a good plan," he agreed cautiously. Vivian smiled, her attention returning to Sophia, who had begun to fuss slightly. "I think someone's getting hungry again. Elena, do you want to take her, or shall I give her the bottle in the refrigerator?" Another surprise. Vivian had initially been critical of Elena's decision to breastfeed. Formula is perfectly adequate, and much more convenient, then equally critical when they'd introduced an occasional bottle of pumped milk to allow more flexibility. "Nipple confusion is a real concern, you know." "You can give her the bottle if you'd like," Elena offered, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. "The lactation consultant says she's mastered switching between breast and bottle without any issues." Vivian brightened visibly at the opportunity for extended bonding time with her granddaughter. As she settled in with Sophia and the bottle, Thomas pulled Elena into the kitchen, ostensibly to prepare more coffee. "Is my mother possessed by a reasonable entity today?" he whispered, only half joking. No argument about the rocking horse, offering to feed with the bottle instead of suggesting formula. Elena smiled, keeping her voice equally low. "I think she's learning, slowly, painfully, but learning nonetheless. She wants to be part of Sophia's life more than she wants to control how we raise her." "The miracle of grandparenthood," Thomas mused, glancing back toward the living room where his mother was softly singing to Sophia as she fed her. "Who would have thought?" "Don't get too comfortable," Elena warned, though her tone was light. She still rearranged the spice rack last week and switched Sophia's pacifiers for those organic rubber ones she ordered without asking us. Thomas laughed softly. "Baby steps. For all of us." They returned to the living room with fresh coffee, finding Vivian expertly burping Sophia with the practiced movements of a woman who, for all her faults, had raised a child of her own. The sight of his formidable mother gently patting his daughter's back, murmuring encouragements in a voice he rarely heard her use, created a complicated tangle of emotions in Thomas's chest: appreciation, wistfulness, a touch of sadness for the warmer relationship they might have had. His conference call pulled him away just as Vivian was settling Sophia for her mid-morning nap. When he emerged from his home office an hour and a half later, he found Elena and his mother engaged in what appeared to be a surprisingly cordial conversation about the practice's expansion plans. "The satellite office makes perfect sense," Vivian was saying as she folded baby blankets with military precision. "Especially with the new development in that area. You'll capture an entirely different demographic." Elena nodded, looking mildly bemused by Vivian's interest in her professional strategy. "That's what our market analysis suggested. We're starting with just 2 days a week to test demand." "Smart," Vivian approved. Roberto used the same approach when expanding Wilson Architecture to the West Side location. Start small, build gradually based on proven performance. Thomas paused in the doorway, reluctant to interrupt this rare moment of genuine connection between his wife and mother. Elena caught his eye and smiled slightly, acknowledging the unusualness of the scene without breaking the conversational flow. "The challenge will be staffing appropriately," she continued. "We don't want to overextend our senior therapists, but clients expect a certain level of experience. Have you considered a mentorship model?" Vivian suggested. When Roberto expanded, he paired experienced architects with promising juniors. The clients got the benefit of the senior name and oversight, while the younger staff gained valuable experience. She refolded a blanket that didn't meet her exacting standards. "I manage the staffing transitions myself, actually. The key is clear communication about who handles which aspects of the client relationship." Thomas finally entered the room fully, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "That sounds like a solid approach. I didn't realize you were so involved in the firm's expansion, Mother." Vivian looked up, something like pride flashing briefly across her features. "There's quite a lot you don't know about my contributions to Wilson Architecture, Thomas. Before you were born, I managed client relations and staffing while your father focused on design and construction oversight. We were quite the team." The revelation was delivered casually, but its implications were significant. Thomas had always understood his parents' marriage as a traditional arrangement, his father the accomplished professional, his mother the society wife and homemaker. The idea that they had once been business partners of sorts, that his mother had played a substantial role in the firm's early success, reaffirmed his understanding of the relationship and of Vivian herself. "I didn't know that," he admitted. "Well, it was a long time ago." Vivian's tone turned dismissive, as if regretting the personal disclosure. "Once you came along, we agreed that one of us should focus on home life. It made sense at the time." The wistfulness in that final statement was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas found himself wondering, not for the first time, how much of his mother's controlling nature stemmed from having channeled her considerable intelligence and organizational talents exclusively into family management after years of professional engagement. Elena, ever perceptive, seemed to catch the same undercurrent. "Sophia's practice could benefit from that kind of structured expansion approach," she said, deliberately using the formal name they'd chosen rather than the nickname Vivian insisted sounded unprofessional. "Would you be willing to share some of your materials from that time? The transition protocols might be adaptable to a therapy practice." The request, genuine but also strategic in its acknowledgement of Vivian's expertise, visibly pleased his mother. "I'm sure I have those files somewhere in the home office. Roberto never throws anything away. I'll look for them this week." The conversation shifted to lunch preparations, but Thomas remained thoughtful as he helped set the table. This new glimpse into his mother's past offered context for behaviors he long found frustrating: her insistence on managing family events with corporate efficiency, her detailed tracking of his academic and professional milestones, her critical assessment of Elena's career ambitions. If Vivian had indeed set aside her own professional identity to raise him, perhaps her investment in his life choices carried dimensions he hadn't fully appreciated. It didn't excuse her more manipulative behaviors, but it helped explain them. An explanation, as Elena often reminded her clients, was often the first step toward change. The remainder of Vivian's visit passed pleasantly enough, with only minor skirmishes over Sophia's sleep schedule and whether 3 months was too young for classical music appreciation classes. When she departed shortly after lunch, leaving behind the promised Coke oven and the still mysterious wrapped package, both Thomas and Elena felt the peculiar mixture of relief and thoughtfulness that characterized the aftermath of Vivian's more successful visits. "That was different," Elena observed as they worked together to clean up the kitchen while Sophia napped. "Did you know about her role in the firm?" Thomas shook his head. "Dad never mentioned it, and Mother always presented herself as solely focused on family and social obligations. It explains some things, though. Like her extreme investment in your career path? And her initial resistance to your professional ambitions." Thomas passed Elena a rinsed plate for the dishwasher. "If she gave up her career for family, she might have expected the same from you." Elena considered this as she methodically loaded dishes. It was a different time, different expectations for women. But still, To invest so much in a career and then set it aside entirely. She shook her head. That's a significant identity shift. No wonder she channeled all that energy and intelligence into micromanaging family life. And social climbing, Thomas added wryly. Her charity board memberships and committee chairships are basically corporate positions without the salary. Compensatory achievements, Elena mused, seeking validation and purpose through alternative channels when the original one was closed. Thomas smiled at her professional analysis. Is my mother one of your case studies now, Dr. Martinez-Wilson? Occupational hazard, she admitted with a shrug. But it does make me think about my own transition back to work, and how fortunate I am to not face the same either-or choice she did. The observation hung between them, a reminder of how much had changed between generations and how much they had to be grateful for in their own situation. Thomas had never questioned Elena's desire to maintain her professional identity alongside motherhood, just as she had supported his decision to adjust his work schedule to be more present for Sophia. Neither of their careers would follow traditional trajectories as a result, but the trade-offs felt right for their family. Should we open her gift? Thomas asked as they finished the kitchen cleanup. The wrapped package had been placed on the counter, its precise creases and elaborate bow unmistakably Vivian's handiwork. Elena nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Might as well see what we're dealing with. Thomas carefully unwrapped the package, preserving the paper out of ingrained habit from childhood Christmases when Vivian had insisted on saving good wrapping for reuse. Inside was a leather-bound album, its cover embossed with Sophia Carmen Wilson in elegant gold script. Well, it's not another inappropriate heirloom or baby etiquette manual, Elena observed with relief. Thomas opened the album to find it already partially filled with photographs, not just recent ones of Sophia, but older images as well. There was Thomas as an infant, sharing Sophia's serious expression and dark hair. Roberto holding newborn Thomas with a proud, if slightly terrified, expression. Vivian in a hospital bed, looking exhausted but radiant as she cradled her son. She made a family album, Elena said softly, peering over his shoulder. With photos from both sides. Indeed, as they turned the pages, they found images Elena recognized from her own childhood, her parents holding her at her baptism, her first steps captured in a slightly blurry snapshot, her 5th birthday party at her parents' restaurant. Somehow, Vivian had obtained these photos, presumably from Carmen and Gabriel, and incorporated them alongside the Wilson family history. Look at the caption. Thomas pointed to the neat handwriting beneath a photo of Elena at her college graduation. Dr. Elena Martinez-Wilson, Sophia's mother, graduate summa cum laude. The acknowledgement of Elena's academic achievements and the deliberate use of her professional title were small details, but significant ones coming from Vivian. As they continued through the album, they found more recent photos, Thomas and Elena on their wedding day, the ultrasound image in the silver frame Roberto had given them, Sophia's first days in the hospital. The final filled page held a photo taken just 2 weeks earlier during Sunday dinner at the Wilson home. Elena was seated in the formal dining room, Sophia in her arms, with Thomas standing behind them. But rather than the standard post-family portrait, this was a candid moment, all three of them laughing at something off-camera, their joy palpable even in the frozen image. I don't remember this being taken, Elena murmured. Neither do I, Thomas admitted. Mother must have captured it without us noticing. The remaining pages were blank, waiting to be filled with future memories. On the inside back cover, Vivian had written a brief note in her elegant script, for Sophia, to know the family that came before her and the love that surrounds her. May these pages fill quickly with joy and laughter. With all my love, Grandmother Wilson. Simple, heartfelt, and notably free of the didactic tone that characterized most of Vivian's communications. Both Thomas and Elena stared at the message for a long moment, absorbing its significance. This is... Elena began, then paused, searching for the right word. Growth, Thomas supplied quietly. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Elena leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they contemplated the album and its meaning. Do you think having Sophia has changed her, or just revealed a side of her that was always there beneath the controlling exterior? Both, maybe, Thomas reflected. Becoming a grandmother has given her a new role, a new purpose that doesn't require managing everyone else's lives. And seeing us as parents rather than just as her son and the woman who married him. That shifts the dynamic too. Plus we've held firm on our boundaries, Elena added. She's had to adapt because we haven't given her the option not to. The baby monitor crackled with the first stirrings of Sophia waking from her nap. Elena straightened, handing the album back to Thomas. I should get her ready for the doctor's appointment. Will you be okay handling the conference call follow-ups while we're gone? Thomas nodded, carefully placing the album on the bookshelf where they kept family photographs and mementos. Take pictures if she does that hilarious outraged face when Dr. Chen examines her ears. Always, Elena promised with a smile, heading upstairs to the nursery. Left alone, Thomas found himself studying the album again, particularly the formal portrait of his parents that Vivian had included toward the beginning. It had been taken around the time of his birth, judging by his mother's hairstyle. They stood side by side in front of the Wilson family home, Roberto's arm around Vivian's waist, both of them looking confidently toward the camera. The image captured something he hadn't noticed before, a partnership of equals, at least for that moment in time. What had changed in the decades since? When had his mother's supportive partnership with his father transformed into the controlling, status-conscious behavior he'd grown up with? Was it a gradual shift as she channeled her professional abilities into managing their domestic life, or had there been specific turning points, disappointments, resentments, unfulfilled ambitions, that hardened her over time? Thomas realized he knew very little about his parents' early relationship or the choices and compromises that had shaped their marriage. Like most children, he had seen only the end result, not the complex journey that created it. The album Vivian had so carefully assembled for Sophia represented more than just a family history. It was perhaps also an attempt to connect across generations, to be seen and understood in a fuller context than their strained relationship had previously allowed. The revelation didn't erase the damage done by Vivian's more manipulative behaviors over the years, particularly the divorce papers incident that had so nearly derailed his marriage. But it offered a perspective that made forgiveness feel more possible, understanding more accessible. When Elena returned downstairs with a freshly changed and remarkably cheerful Sophia, Thomas shared some of these thoughts as he helped gather the diaper bag essentials for their outing. Do you think I should ask her about it? He wondered aloud. About her work at the firm, about when and why she stopped. Elena considered the question carefully as she secured Sophia in her carrier. I think so, yes. But frame it as genuine interest in her experience, not as accusation or therapy. Give her the chance to tell her own story without judgment. Thomas nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Elena's approach. Next week, maybe. When she's here for her regular visit. Speaking of which, Elena paused at the door, Sophia contentedly gurgling in her carrier. I was thinking we might invite your parents to join mine for Sophia's baptism reception. Not the planning, just the event itself. A first step toward more integrated family gatherings. The suggestion was significant. Until now, they had carefully separated extended family events to minimize potential tensions. Bringing both sets of grandparents together would require diplomatic skills worthy of international peace negotiations, but it also represented an important evolution in their family dynamics. Carmen and Vivian at the same event? Are you sure the universe won't implode? Thomas asked, only half joking. Elena smiled. They found common ground at Thanksgiving, remember? And Sophia deserves to have all her grandparents together for important milestones. We'll set clear expectations beforehand, keep it short, and have Maya on standby for emergency intervention if needed. The mental image of Maya running interference between their mothers made Thomas laugh. All right, let's try it. Worst case scenario, we get another family story for Sophia to hear when she's older. Best case scenario, we start building new traditions that honor all parts of her heritage, Elena countered, her expression softening as she looked down at their daughter. She's worth the effort. She is, Thomas agreed, leaning down to press a kiss to Sophia's forehead before straightening to kiss Elena properly. You both are. As Elena and Sophia departed for their appointments, Thomas returned to his home office, the morning's revelations still reverberating through his thoughts. The album Vivian had created sat on his desk as he worked, a tangible reminder of the complex legacies that shaped their family and the ongoing work of understanding, forgiving, and growing beyond inherited patterns. The baptism reception, held on a perfect spring Sunday when Sophia was 5 months old, became the testing ground for their evolving family dynamics. They'd chosen a private room at a restaurant midway between their home and the church, neutral territory that belonged to neither family tradition. Elena's parents arrived first, Carmen bringing homemade pastries despite assurances that the restaurant would provide dessert. Just a little something extra, she insisted, presenting the carefully packaged sweets to the waitstaff with detailed reheating instructions. Gabriel carried a large wrap package that turned out to be a hand-carved wooden cross, made by his brother in New Mexico, intended for Sophia's nursery. The Wilsons arrived precisely on time, Vivian resplendent in a pale blue suit that somehow conveyed appropriate religious observance while making a clear statement about her social status. Roberto followed with a significantly smaller package and the slightly harried expression he always wore at formal family functions. Everything went beautifully at the church, Vivian announced as she air-kissed Elena's cheeks. Sophia was absolutely perfect, not a single cry during the entire ceremony. Wilson babies have always had excellent deportment at religious events. Carmen, who had witnessed the same ceremony and might have had her own assessment of her granddaughter's performance, merely smiled and offered Vivian a piece of her homemade almond pastry. "Try this, Vivian." Family recipe, very traditional. To everyone's mild surprise, Vivian accepted the offering and took a delicate bite. "Delicious," she pronounced after a moment. "Reminds me of the pastries I had in Barcelona years ago. You must give me the recipe." "Of course," Carmen agreed warmly. "I'll write it out for you. The recipes are just guidelines, you understand. The real secret is in how you feel the dough as you work it." Intuitive baking, Vivian nodded, as if this aligned with some fundamental principle she'd long held. Like good design, there are rules, but also artistry. Thomas, overhearing this exchange as he returned from settling Sophia in her portable bassinet, caught Elena's eye with raised eyebrows. She shrugged slightly, her expression suggesting that perhaps the feared collision of their mothers wasn't going to materialize after all. The meal progressed with surprising harmony. Gabriel and Roberto discovered a shared interest in woodworking, leading to an animated discussion of tools and techniques that effectively occupied them for most of the first course. Carmen and Vivian, after the initial pastry breakthrough, found additional common ground in their opinions on local schools, both surprisingly current despite neither having school-aged children, and their frustrations with modern customer service standards. "Did you know our mothers are bonding over hating automated phone systems?" Thomas whispered to Elena as they checked on Sophia between courses. And apparently agreeing that children today don't write proper thank you notes, Elena replied with quiet amusement. "Should we be concerned or celebrating?" "Definitely celebrating. If they join forces, they'll be twice as formidable but half as focused on critiquing us specifically." Elena laughed, adjusting Sophia's blanket as she slept peacefully through her first multi-generational family gathering. Divide and conquer in reverse. The reception ended with a toast proposed by Roberto, who had grown more relaxed as the meal progressed. To Sophia, he raised his glass, blessed with the best of both family traditions. And to Thomas and Elena, who have created a family that honors its roots while growing in new directions. The sentiment, delivered with uncharacteristic eloquence from the typically reticent Roberto, moved both Thomas and Elena. As glasses clinked and congratulations were exchanged, Thomas noticed something remarkable: his mother and Elena's mother standing side by side, each peering into Sophia's bassinet with identical expressions of grandmotherly adoration, momentarily united by their shared love for the same small person. "Would you look at that?" he murmured to Elena, nodding toward the scene. She followed his gaze, a smile spreading across her face. "The universal language of grandmotherhood," she observed. "More powerful than any differences." Later, as they gathered their things to leave, Vivian approached Elena privately while Thomas was distracted by loading gifts into their car. "The ceremony was lovely," she said, her usual crisp tone softened slightly. "You and Thomas have done well, creating these moments for Sophia." Coming from Vivian, This qualified as effusive praise. Elena accepted it with a gracious nod. Thank you. It means a lot to have both families together for these milestones. Vivian glanced across the room to where Carmen was expertly swaddling a now awake Sophia with the practiced movements of an experienced grandmother. Your mother is quite good with her, she observed, without the comparative assessment Elena might have expected. Sophia clearly adores her. She adores you too, Elena replied, the peace offering implicit in her tone. Your weekly visits are highlights for her. She always sleeps better on the days you've been with her. This small affirmation, acknowledging Vivian's importance in Sophia's life, visibly pleased her mother-in-law. I've been thinking, Vivian said after a moment, perhaps when she's a bit older, you and Thomas might consider letting her stay overnight occasionally at her home. Not regularly, of course, but for special occasions. We could convert Thomas's old room into a proper space for her. The suggestion, delivered as a tentative query rather than Vivian's usual directive, represented significant progress from the woman who had once arrived with false divorce papers to break up their marriage. It acknowledged their parental authority and requested permission rather than assuming entitlement. I think that would be wonderful, Elena said sincerely. When she's ready for overnight stays away from us, you and Roberto should absolutely be part of that experience. The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's return, but the moment of understanding between the two women lingered, another small step in their gradually improving relationship. And then the little rabbit found his way home, where his mother was waiting with open arms and fresh carrots for dinner. Elena finished reading, closing the colorful storybook as she gazed down at her daughter. Sophia, now 18 months old and a bundle of perpetual motion during waking hours, had finally succumbed to sleep, her dark eyelashes fanned against chubby cheeks still flushed from the excitement of her day. Elena carefully extricated herself from the rocking chair, placing the book on the nearby shelf before adjusting the light blanket over Sophia's sleeping form. The nursery had evolved with their daughter, the neutral greens and yellows of her infant space now enhanced with colorful wall decals of woodland creatures that Sophia loved to point at and name in her developing vocabulary. Fa. For fox, but for bunny, and owl, which somehow she pronounced perfectly while mangling simpler words. Elena quietly closed the door, leaving it cracked just enough for the hallway nightlight to cast a reassuring glow into the room. Despite her professional knowledge of childhood development and sleep hygiene, she found herself making the same emotional compromises all parents did, knowing Sophia no longer needed the light but keeping it on anyway, a small concession to her own protective instincts. Downstairs, she found Thomas at the dining room table, surrounded by architectural plans and a laptop displaying complex modeling software. His glasses were perched on top of his head, forgotten there when he'd most likely rubbed his tired eyes. He looked up as she descended the stairs, his face softening from concentration into a smile. Success? He asked, referring to their nightly bedtime ritual, which had grown increasingly complex as Sophia discovered the power of one more story, and water, please as delay tactics. 3 books, 2 songs, and only one attempt to climb out of the crib, Elena confirmed, collapsing onto the chair across from him. I'm counting it as a win. Thomas chuckled, closing his laptop. Our standards have certainly evolved. Remember when we thought parenthood would be all tender moments and Instagram-worthy milestones? Elena stretched, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders from carrying an increasingly heavy toddler throughout the day. No one warned us about the Olympic-level negotiations just to get teeth brushed. Or the strategic planning required to introduce vegetables, Thomas added, stacking his plans neatly as he cleared the table. Speaking of which, do we have a game plan for tomorrow? My mother texted to confirm she's still keeping Sophia while we have our anniversary dinner. Their anniversary. The date that had once nearly torn them apart had, in the years since, been reclaimed as a celebration of their resilience and commitment. This year would mark their 8th, and the first where they'd planned an evening completely to themselves, with Vivian volunteering to watch Sophia overnight at their house. Everything's packed in her overnight bag, Elena confirmed. Extra clothes, favorite stuffed animals, the specific blanket she needs right now, the books your mother hasn't heard 8,000 times. I've written out the bedtime routine, though I'm sure your mother will ignore half of it and somehow still get Sophia to sleep better than we do. Thomas smiled at the accurate assessment of his mother's mysterious grandmotherly powers. Sophia adores her Gamma Viv. Who would have thought the evolution of Vivian from interfering mother-in-law to beloved grandmother had been one of the more surprising developments of the past 2 years? While she still maintained her exacting standards and occasional tendency toward unsolicited advice, becoming a grandmother had softened her in ways both subtle and profound. Most significantly, she had learned to defer to Thomas and Elena's parental decisions, even when she clearly disagreed with them, a hard-won respect that had transformed their family dynamics. "Your mother was born to be a grandmother," Elena observed, moving to the kitchen to pour them both glasses of wine. "All the control and influence she craves without the day-to-day responsibilities of actual parenting. Plus Sophia thinks the sun rises and sets on her Gamma Viv," Thomas added, accepting the glass Elena offered. "Nothing like unconditional adoration to bring out the best in someone." They settled on the couch together, Elena tucking her feet under Thomas's leg in a practiced movement that spoke of years of comfortable intimacy. The house was quiet around them, the evening routine complete, toys returned to baskets, dishes cleaned and put away, tomorrow's necessities laid out with the efficiency of parents who had learned the hard way that mornings with a toddler left no time for searching. "Did you finish the Westbrook proposal?" Elena asked, nodding toward the architectural plans Thomas had been working on. He nodded. "Just needs one final review. Their clients love the sustainable elements, the rainwater harvesting system, the passive solar design. It's the kind of project I've wanted to work on for years." The pride in his voice was well-earned. Over the past 3 years, Thomas had gradually shifted his focus at Wilson Architecture, specializing in environmentally conscious residential design. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Some of the firm's more traditional clients and partners had been skeptical of the green approach, but Roberto had supported Thomas's vision, recognizing the growing market for sustainable homes. "What about your meeting with the hospital board?" Thomas asked, shifting to Elena's professional life. "Any decision on the mental health wing redesign?" Elena smiled, still slightly amazed that her career had taken this unexpected turn. What had begun as a casual conversation with Thomas about the psychological impact of healthcare environments had evolved into a specialized consultation role, with Elena advising on the design of therapeutic spaces for mental health treatment. "They approved our full proposal," she confirmed. "Construction starts next quarter." "That's fantastic." Thomas raised his glass in a toast. "To the Martinez-Wilson Professional Partnership, changing the world one building at a time." Elena clinked her glass against his, savoring both the wine and the sentiment. Their collaboration, her psychological expertise informing his architectural designs, had begun as an interesting side project but had developed into a significant aspect of both their careers. Thomas now regularly consulted Elena on his residential projects, considering the psychological impact of spaces alongside their physical functionality. Elena, meanwhile, had published several papers on environmental psychology that had raised her professional profile in new and exciting ways. "We should celebrate properly," Thomas suggested, setting down his wine glass. "Not just our anniversary tomorrow, but this hospital project. It's a major achievement." "What did you have in mind?" Elena asked, recognizing the subtle shift in his tone that suggested he was already formulating a plan. "Remember that cabin we rented, right after our 5th anniversary? The one by the lake?" Elena's expression softened with the memory. "Of course. It was exactly what we needed then. I looked it up last week, it's available for Labor Day weekend. I thought maybe we could take Sophia, show her the lake, the trails. Make it a family tradition." The suggestion touched Elena deeply. That weekend at the cabin had been a turning point in their marriage, a healing retreat after Vivian's disastrous intervention. The idea of returning there with their daughter, transforming a place of recovery into one of family joy, felt powerfully right. "I love that idea," she said warmly. "Sophia would be enchanted by the woods, the water. And it would be meaningful for us too, coming full circle." Thomas reached for her hand, interlacing their fingers. "3 years ago, we went there to figure out our future. Now we can go back with the living embodiment of that future." The observation hung between them, simple but profound. So much had changed since that weekend retreat, professionally, personally, in their relationships with extended family. Yet the core of who they were together remained steady, strengthened by the challenges they'd faced and the life they built. Speaking of Sophia, Elena said after a comfortable silence, "I've been thinking about the preschool question." Thomas groaned good-naturedly. Not the great educational debate again. The great educational debate had become their shorthand for an ongoing discussion about Sophia's future schooling. Vivian advocated strongly for the prestigious private academy that had educated generations of Wilsons. Elena's parents favored the diverse public Montessori program that emphasized cultural inclusion. Thomas and Elena found themselves weighing all options, including several that neither set of grandparents had considered. "I visited that new early childhood center near your office," Elena continued. "The one with the nature-based curriculum. It was impressive. The children spend most of the day outdoors, regardless of weather. There's a real emphasis on problem-solving, on learning through exploration rather than structured lessons." "And how does that align with your child development expertise?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. Elena's professional background gave her insights into educational approaches that he valued tremendously. "The research is compelling. Children who have more unstructured outdoor time show better attention development, more creative thinking, even improved physical coordination." She hesitated. "But it's not what your mother would consider a proper educational foundation." Thomas smiled wryly. "Very little is, by her standards." "She'll have opinions," Elena warned. "Strong ones." "When doesn't she?" Thomas countered. "But she's learned to express those opinions and then accept her decisions, even when she disagrees with them." He squeezed Elena's hand. "That's the boundary we established, and she's respected it remarkably well, especially when it comes to Sophia." This was true. For all Vivian's strong feelings about child-rearing, she had maintained the boundaries Thomas had so clearly established following their anniversary confrontation. She offered her thoughts, often emphatically, but ultimately deferred to their parental authority without the manipulation or passive-aggressive behaviors that had characterized her approach in the past. "What does your intuition tell you?" Thomas asked after a moment. "Beyond the research, beyond the competing family expectations, what feels right for Sophia specifically?" Elena considered the question seriously. "She's so physical, so curious about the natural world. You've seen how she lights up when we're at the park, how she can spend an hour examining a line of ants or building with sticks and stones." She smiled at the memory of their daughter's intense focus during such explorations. "I think she would thrive in an environment that nurtures that natural curiosity, that doesn't try to channel it into traditional academic structures too early." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "We should visit together. See if my impressions align with yours." "And if they do?" Elena pressed gently. "Then we make our decision based on what's best for our daughter. We inform our families respectfully but firmly, and we move forward." His tone held the quiet confidence that had developed since becoming a father, a certainty about priorities that left no room for undue outside influence. "Just as we've done with every other important choice." Elena leaned forward to kiss him softly. "When did you get so wise, Mr. Wilson?" "Approximately 18 months ago, when a tiny dictator took over our lives and forced me to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't," he replied with a smile against her lips. Elena took a mental photograph, storing the image alongside other precious memories. Thomas's face when Sophia was born, her first smile, her first tentative steps across their living room floor. Rather than wake them, Elena retrieved the light blanket that had been kicked aside and draped it gently over both father and daughter. She pressed a soft kiss to each of their foreheads before returning downstairs to finish her wine and flip through the novel she'd been trying to complete for months. Tomorrow was their anniversary, 8 years since they had stood before family and friends to promise their lives to each other. The journey had contained more challenges than either could have anticipated on that hopeful day, but also more joy, more growth, more reasons to be grateful for the choice they'd made. The following evening, Elena descended the stairs in a midnight blue dress that Thomas immediately recognized, the same one she'd worn on their 5th anniversary, the night Vivian had arrived with divorce papers. The deliberate choice was not lost on him, though the dress hugged her curves slightly differently now, her body subtly transformed by pregnancy and motherhood in ways he found endlessly fascinating.